Act 1 Act 1, Chapter 1. The training ground past the eastern wall was empty at this hour, which was exactly why Naruto liked it. No one came out here after midnight except stray cats and the occasional patrol, and even the patrols rarely bothered checking the far clearing where the grass had been chewed to dirt by months of his own footwork. He stood in the center of that dirt circle with his hands already forming the cross seal, sweat cutting clean lines down a face smeared with dust. Around him, in ragged rows that would have made any sensible instructor wince, stood 11 clones. Not the 20 he had managed the week before. Not the 15 from 3 nights ago. 11, and even that had cost him more than it should have. Again, he said, to no one and everyone. The clones dissolved in staggered puffs, and he reformed the seal before the last of the smoke cleared. Chunin exams were coming. He did not know the exact date yet, only that Kakashi had mentioned it twice in the last week with the particular vagueness adults used when they were deciding whether you were ready for something. Sasuke trained every day until his hands split. Sakura had started showing up to practice with a notebook full of chakra theory she copied out of library scrolls. Naruto had nothing like that. What he had was time, and clones, and the stubborn conviction that if he could not outthink anyone, he would simply outwork them until working harder stopped being a disadvantage. 12 clones this time. He felt the drain immediately, a hollow pulling sensation behind his navel that he had learned to recognize and, foolishly, learned to ignore. The clones scattered into their drills, some sparring against each other, some running through the water walking exercise at the creek's edge, one sitting cross-legged and trying, badly, to hold a strand of chakra steady between 2 fingers the way Kakashi had once demonstrated almost as an afterthought. Naruto watched them with a strange doubled awareness, feeling each small failure and each small correction arrive in his own mind like distant static. It should not have worked as well as it did. That was the part nobody had explained to him. Every genin he knew struggled to manage a fraction of this many clones without their chakra reserves crashing to empty inside a few minutes. Naruto had been running variations of this drill for almost 2 hours. He noticed the ache too late. It started as a tightness at the base of his skull, easy to mistake for simple exhaustion. Then his vision narrowed at the edges, the way it did right before a fever broke, and the sensation behind his navel that had felt like a gentle pull became something closer to a fist closing. "Hey," he said aloud, to the nearest clone, and heard his own voice come out thinner than he intended. The clone did not answer. It was staring at its own hands, and Naruto understood with a lurch that something in the chakra feeding it had gone wrong, some balance he did not have the vocabulary to name tipping past the point he had never actually tested before. One by one the clones around the clearing stiffened, flickered, and popped out of existence in quick, ugly succession, dumping their accumulated sensation back into him all at once instead of the gradual trickle he was used to. The world tilted. He got one hand out to catch himself against the training post and missed it by a wide margin, catching only air, and the ground came up faster than it should have. There was a strange heat spreading through his chest, not painful exactly, more like something inside him working far too hard to keep pace with the demand it had never been asked to meet. Kurama's presence stirred somewhere at the back of his mind, a low rumble of irritation and something that might almost have been concern. And then that too went distant and muffled, as though a door had swung shut between them. Naruto's last clear thought, lying in the churned dirt of a training ground no one else used, was that he had pushed too far again, that this was going to be embarrassing to explain in the morning, and that he really hoped nobody found him like this. Then the night closed over him, and the clearing was quiet except for the wind moving through the grass and the faint, sourceless hum of chakra still bleeding slowly out of a boy who had, without knowing it, just done something that should not have been possible for a 12-year-old genin to survive doing wrong. He did not hear the footsteps that found him an hour later. He did not feel the hand that pressed 2 fingers to his throat, went still with surprise, and then began, very carefully, to search him for the reason why a boy with a chakra network this scrambled was still breathing at all. Chapter 2. Tsunade had not meant to come anywhere near Konoha. That was the joke of it. The kind of joke the world liked to play on her specifically, the kind she had stopped finding funny sometime around the 2nd decade of running from a village full of memories she could not pay off no matter how many towns she drifted through. She and Shizen had made camp 2 ridgelines out, close enough to buy proper sake in the border town without walking all the way into Fire Country's capital, far enough that nobody would recognize the woman everyone still called Lady Tsunade even though she had not answered to a Konoha rank in years. Shizen had gone to check their supplies were not being watched. Tsunade had gone for air, and a smoke, and the particular quiet that came from being somewhere nobody expected her to be anybody's anything. She smelled the blood before she saw the boy. Not much blood. A scraped knuckle, a split lip from where his face had met the ground. It was not the blood that stopped her. It was the chakra. Even at 30 paces it hit her like a hand against her chest, an unstable, uneven pulse rolling off a small crumpled shape at the center of a torn-up training clearing, the kind of signature that in her long medical career she associated almost exclusively with 2 categories of patient: the dying and the recently resurrected. She had spent enough decades around chakra exhaustion to know this was either, not quite, and that unclassifiable middle ground was exactly the sort of thing that made the back of her neck prickle with old professional instinct she had spent years trying to bury. She was kneeling beside him before she had consciously decided to move. He was a boy. Genin age, maybe younger, blonde hair matted with sweat and dirt, an orange jacket that had seen better decades. His pulse under her fingers was thready and much too fast, his skin cool where it should have been warm from exertion. She peeled back an eyelid out of pure habit and found nothing alarming there, which was almost more alarming, because it meant whatever was wrong with him was happening somewhere deeper than the obvious places. "Idiot kid," she muttered, and it came out gentler than she meant it to. She laid 2 fingers against his sternum and pushed a thin, careful thread of her own chakra into him, the diagnostic technique so old and so automatic she barely had to think about the seals anymore. What came back made her go very still. His chakra coils were a mess, that much matched what she expected from a genin who had clearly overreached on some solo drill in the middle of the night. Frayed at the edges, inflamed in patches, the network equivalent of a runner who had sprinted on a torn muscle and kept going out of sheer stubbornness. That part she had seen 100 times. What she had not seen, not in this particular combination, not in a body this young, was the way his system was already correcting itself. Not slowly, the way a healthy shinobi's chakra reservoirs would refill on their own over hours or days. Actively. She watched threads of raw, disorganized energy knitting frayed pathways back together in real time, an accelerated repair process running well beneath conscious control, layered underneath and around a second, much larger presence she recognized instantly, and which made her breath catch for an entirely different reason. There was a seal on his stomach. She did not need to lift his shirt to know that. She could feel its architecture from here, elegant and old-fashioned in a way that only one man she had ever known had designed seals. Minato's boy, she thought, and something in her chest that had been closed for a very long time creaked open half an inch against her will. She sat back on her heels, chakra still humming faintly between her fingers and his skin, and for a moment simply looked at him. At the whisker marks on his cheeks, faint under the grime. At the strange, layered signature underneath the fox's chakra, something she could not immediately name, some secondary current running through his coils that behaved less like ordinary chakra and more like the beginnings of something structural, something built rather than simply born. "Shizen," she called, not loudly, but with the particular flatness in her voice that Shizen had long since learned meant drop whatever you are doing. Footsteps arrived within seconds. Shizen's sharp intake of breath, when she saw the boy and then saw Tsunade's face, told her everything she needed to know about how visible her own shock had become. "Lady Tsunade. Is he? He's stable enough to move," Tsunade said, already sliding one arm under his shoulders. "But we are not leaving him out here like this." She did not say the rest of it out loud. Not yet. Not the part where some instinct she had thought long dead, some flicker of the same fascination that had once made her the best medical mind of her generation, was already turning the shape of his chakra network over and over in her mind, looking for an explanation that made sense and finding, so far, none at all. Chapter 3. The inn they carried him to was small, cheap, and mercifully empty of other guests. Shizen paid for the room without haggling, which told Tsunade how rattled her assistant still was, since Shizen haggled over everything on principle. They laid the boy on the single bed and Tsunade set to work properly this time, not the quick diagnostic sweep of the training ground but a full assessment, sleeves pushed up, both hands glowing with steady green light as she worked down from his skull to his fingertips. Shizen assisted without being asked, passing supplies, monitoring his pulse, saying nothing, because she had learned long ago that Tsunade thought better out loud and worse when interrupted. His reserves are recovering faster than they should, Tsunade said, mostly to herself. Faster than mine did at his age. Faster than mine do now, honestly. The fox, Shizen said quietly. Partly. Tsunade's frown deepened. The fox accounts for raw output. It does not account for this. She traced 2 fingers an inch above his abdomen without touching skin, following a current only she could feel. There is a second pattern here. Underneath the seal, threaded through his own coils. It behaves like it wants to be a pathway. Like a riverbed waiting for water that has not arrived yet. Wants to be a pathway to what? Tsunade did not answer right away. She was thinking of an old family, mostly gone now, famous for exactly 2 things in equal measure. Sealing mastery beyond anything the other clans ever matched, and whispered about far less often because it made lesser shinobi uneasy, a rare bloodline expression that let certain Uzumaki manipulate their own chakra into physical binding constructs. Chains, sharp-edged and merciless, capable of restraining even a tailed beast if the wielder's control and reserves were deep enough. She had seen it exactly once, decades ago, in a woman with hair the color of fresh blood who had very nearly killed her in a training spar meant to be friendly. His mother, Tsunade murmured. Lady Tsunade? Nothing. Old history. She straightened, rolling tension out of her shoulders, and looked down at the sleeping boy with an expression Shizen had not seen on her mentor's face in years, something between wariness and something warmer that she did not let herself name yet. I want to keep him under observation. Just for a day or 2. Until his coils have finished settling. We were not planning to stay in fire country this long. I'm aware. Tsunade pulled a chair up beside the bed and sat, arms crossed, in a posture that made it clear the conversation about leaving was, for the moment, closed. Humor me, Shizen. It has been a long time since I found something worth staying awake for that did not involve a dice cup. Shizen studied her for a long moment, then let out a breath that was half exasperation and half something gentler. You already care about him. You have known him for 2 hours. I care about the puzzle, Tsunade said, too quickly to be entirely convincing. The chakra architecture alone is worth another day's delay. That's all this is. Shizen did not argue, though the look on her face said plainly that she did not believe a word of it, and had not since the moment she watched Tsunade lift an unconscious stranger's boy off the dirt with the same careful urgency she used to reserve for patients she had already decided, somewhere down in the part of herself she guarded most fiercely, that she was not going to lose. Outside, the last of the night was thinning toward gray. Somewhere back in the village, a genin team would wake in a few hours to find one of their own missing from his usual haunts, and somewhere in that village's administrative offices, an old man who had buried too many people he loved would eventually hear a report that would make him set down whatever he was doing and go very still. None of that had happened yet. For now there was only a small room, a lamp burning low, and a woman who had spent years convincing herself she had nothing left to give to medicine sitting vigil over a boy whose chakra refused to behave like anything she had ever studied in 40 years of trying. Chapter 4. Naruto woke up the way he usually did after pushing too hard, which was all at once and with the specific outrage of someone who felt cheated out of the last hour of a good dream. Where, he started, then registered the unfamiliar ceiling, the unfamiliar smell of someone else's soap, and a woman he had never seen in his life sitting in a chair beside the bed watching him with an expression that managed to be both clinical and unreasonably amused. Awake, Tsunade said. Good. Means I did not need to work as hard as I thought I might. Naruto sat up too fast, felt the room tip sideways, and let himself be pushed back down by a hand that was gentler than her voice suggested it would be. Who are you? Where's my headband? Where am? Small in, outside Konoha's east gate, and your headband is on the nightstand where it's been since I took it off you so it didn't dig into your neck while you slept for 11 hours. She said it all in one flat, efficient breath, the tone of someone who had delivered variations of that sentence 1,000 times before to 1,000 other patients who woke up confused and combative. You collapsed in a training clearing from what I'm fairly sure was chakra exhaustion stacked on top of something considerably stranger. I'm a traveling medic. My assistant and I found you. Naruto blinked at her, taking in the details his half-awake brain had skipped over. Blonde hair pulled back, a diamond-shaped mark on her forehead he could not stop staring at for a second too long, a green vest that did not look like anything he recognized from the shinobi he knew in the village. Older than his mental image of a medic, but there was nothing frail about the way she held herself, nothing frail in hands that had clearly done real work. 11 hours, he repeated, and then, with the singular focus of a boy whose priorities rarely changed no matter the emergency, did I miss breakfast? Something in the woman's face cracked, just slightly, into what might have been the beginning of a laugh she was suppressing on principle. There's food on the table. Eat slowly, your stomach's not going to appreciate anything fast right now. He ate like a boy who had genuinely never encountered a meal he did not intend to finish in record time, and Tsunade watched him do it with the particular attentiveness of someone gathering data disguised as idle conversation. You've got quite a chakra network on you, kid, she said, once he had slowed down enough to actually chew. What's your name? Naruto Uzumaki. He said it around a mouthful of rice, then swallowed properly and said it again with a bit more ceremony, the way he always did, like the name itself was something worth announcing. Future Hokage. What's yours, Granny? Granny, Tsunade repeated, in a voice that promised there would be consequences for that later, though her eyes had gone briefly distant and unreadable at the word Uzumaki, as if she had been expecting it, and it had still managed to land somewhere unguarded. You can call me Tsunade. Okay, Granny Tsunade. He grinned at her, entirely unbothered by whatever look had just crossed her face, and reached for more rice. Shizen, arranging supplies by the window, made a small choking sound that she quickly turned into a cough. Tsunade let the nickname go, mostly because arguing about it felt like more effort than it was worth and partly because there was something disarming about a kid who clearly had no idea he was talking to one of the 3 legendary Sannin, and treated her with exactly the same easy familiarity he seemed to treat everyone. She had met plenty of shinobi who postured, who tried to impress her the moment they learned her name. This one had not even asked. Tell me something, she said, folding her hands on her knee, deliberately casual. What were you doing out at that training ground at that hour, working yourself into the ground like that? Naruto's grin dimmed a little, replaced by something more serious that looked strange on a face built for mischief. Chunin exams are coming up. I need to be strong enough. Everyone on my team is already way ahead of me and I've got, I don't know, months of catching up to do in like a few weeks. And the shadow clones? 12 at once, from what I could tell. His eyebrows shot up. You could tell that? I could tell a lot of things, Tsunade said, and did not elaborate further, filing the answer away alongside everything else she intended to keep turning over in her mind until it made sense. You should be more careful. Whatever you're carrying in there, kid, it's not something you want to test the limits of alone in the dark with nobody around to catch you if it goes wrong. Naruto shrugged, the universal gesture of a boy who had heard some version of that warning many times before and filed it under things adults said that did not apply to him specifically. Nothing's ever gone that wrong before. Tsunade looked at him for a long moment, thinking about a chakra network that repaired itself faster than any medical text had a right to explain, thinking about a current beneath the fox's presence that behaved like an unfinished bloodline waiting to wake up, thinking about a woman with red hair from 30 years ago who had once broken her wrist in a friendly spar without even trying. It will eventually, she said quietly. And when it does, I'd rather be somewhere nearby. Chapter 5. Konoha's gates had not changed in the years Tsunade had spent avoiding them. Same green roofs beyond the wall, same familiar chakra signature of the barrier seals humming against her skin as she approached, same gate guards who did a visible double take and then, to their credit, said absolutely nothing beyond a polite nod as she walked through beside a limping, still slightly unsteady genin who insisted the whole way that he did not need help walking. I'm fine, Naruto said for the 4th time, catching himself on a fence post as his balance briefly betrayed him. You're upright, Tsunade said. That's a different thing than fine. She had told herself she was only walking him back to make sure he did not collapse again somewhere between the training ground and his own front door, a reasonable medical precaution and nothing more. She had told herself the same thing about staying an extra night at the inn, about the extra hour of diagnostics she had run on him that morning under the flimsy pretense of confirming his coils had stabilized. Shizen, walking a step behind them both with the patient expression of someone who had stopped believing her mentor's cover stories sometime around sunrise, said nothing, which was its own kind of commentary. The village itself pressed in around Tsunade in ways she had half forgotten and half never stopped remembering. The same bakery on the corner that Nawaki used to beg her to visit after training. The hospital roofline, visible over the market stalls, where she had once spent entire years of her life trying and failing to save people who mattered to her using hands that, in the end, had not been enough. She kept her eyes forward and her steps steady and did not let any of it show on her face, a discipline 30 years in the making. "You've got a team," she said, mostly to fill the silence and steer her own thoughts elsewhere. "Who's your sensei? Kakashi? Kakashi Hatake?" Naruto said it with the particular exasperated fondness of a student describing a teacher who was constantly, infuriatingly late. "He's supposed to be some kind of genius, but he's also always 3 hours behind schedule and reads this weird orange book in front of us like it's totally normal." Tsunade's mouth twitched. She knew the name. Everyone who had served through the war years knew the name. The boy who had grown into a man carrying more losses than a person his age should have had to carry, and something about hearing him described in such thoroughly unimpressed, thoroughly 12-year-old terms made the whole weight of the last decade feel briefly, absurdly lighter. "And your teammates?" "Sakura and Sasuke." A slight shift crossed his face at the second name, complicated and hard to read fully. Something between rivalry and something that looked almost like grief for a friendship that had not quite become what he wanted it to be yet. "Sasuke's really strong. Like, actually scary strong. Sakura's smart, way smarter than me. I'm kind of the one everyone worries is going to hold the team back." "Is that what they tell you?" "Nobody has to tell me. I can see the way people look at the three of us sometimes." He said it without much self-pity, more as flat observation, the tone of a kid who had made peace with an unfair reality a long time ago and simply worked around it instead of complaining about it. Tsunade filed that away too, next to everything else, a small hard knot of anger at a village that could look at a boy carrying what he carried and somehow still managed to make him feel like the weakest one in the room. They reached a modest apartment building on a quiet side street, and Naruto turned to her at the base of the stairs with the sudden, slightly awkward formality of someone who had just remembered social obligations existed. "Thanks, Granny Tsunade. For, finding me. And the food. And not telling anyone I passed out like an idiot." "I make no promises about that last part," Tsunade said, though there was no real threat in it. "Get some real sleep tonight. Actual sleep, in an actual bed, no training grounds involved." "Yes, ma'am." He gave her a mock salute, grinned, and bounded up the stairs 2 at a time, apparently already fully recovered by the standards of a 12-year-old stamina, if not by any standard Tsunade would have approved as a medic. She watched him disappear inside, then stood there a moment longer than necessary, looking up at that ordinary window in that ordinary building where an extraordinary and entirely unfinished chakra network was currently, presumably, falling asleep without the faintest idea what it was. "You're staying," Shizen said from beside her. It was not a question. "A few more days," Tsunade said. "Just to be sure his coils hold." "Lady Tsunade." "A few more days, Shizen." But she was still looking at the window, and there was nothing in her voice that sounded like a woman planning to leave any time soon. Chapter 6. Team 7's training ground was busier at midday than the clearing Naruto usually haunted at midnight, and Tsunade found a shaded spot at the tree line where she could watch without announcing herself, a habit left over from years of moving through the world unnoticed by choice rather than necessity. She told herself she was only confirming his recovery held under real exertion. That was almost true. Kakashi had the 3 of them running a drill she recognized immediately, a modified version of the bell test chase and evade exercise, meant less to test them against him this time and more to force them to coordinate against each other's blind spots. Sasuke moved like something honed rather than taught, every motion economical and sharp. Sakura's chakra control, even from a distance, read as noticeably more refined than either of her teammates, precise where theirs was raw. And Naruto ran through the exercise the way he seemed to do most things, with more effort than elegance, throwing himself at problems until something gave. It was going well enough, until it was not. A training log, one of the heavy-weighted ones stacked at the clearing's edge for strength drills, came loose from its rope mooring at exactly the wrong moment, swinging free and dropping toward Sakura's back while her attention was locked on Sasuke's approach from the opposite direction. Naruto moved before anyone, including himself, seemed to fully register what was happening. He was too far away. Tsunade saw the geometry of it instantly, the distance, the angle, the simple physical impossibility of a boy covering that ground in time by ordinary means, and she was already half rising from her crouch, chakra gathering in her hands out of pure reflex, when something changed in the air around him. A thin thread of golden chakra lashed out from his outstretched arm, faster than the eye should have been able to follow, and wrapped once around the falling log with a crack like a whip closing. It was not much. It held for perhaps a second and a half before it dissolved, and the deflection it managed was clumsy, more a redirection of momentum than a controlled catch, enough to send the log skidding wide instead of striking Sakura, but not enough to stop it cleanly. Still, it was enough. Sakura stumbled clear, more startled than hurt. Sasuke had gone very still, dark eyes fixed on Naruto's arm with an intensity that missed nothing. Kakashi's visible eye had narrowed in a way that told Tsunade, even from this distance, that he had seen exactly what she had seen and understood exactly how impossible it should have been. Naruto himself was staring at his own hand like it belonged to someone else, breathing hard, the log forgotten entirely. "What was that?" Sasuke said, flat and immediate, already walking over. "I don't know," Naruto said, and for once there was no bravado in it at all, just genuine bewilderment. I saw it falling and I thought I had to stop it and then." "Chakra chain," Tsunade murmured to herself, low enough that only she could hear it, and felt something in her chest tighten with a mixture of vindication and worry that did not often travel together. Uncontrolled. Unstable. Exactly the kind of premature bloodline expression that, without proper guidance, tended to either burn out entirely from disuse or, worse, erupt again at some far more dangerous moment with no warning at all. She watched Kakashi crouch in front of his student, speaking too quietly for her to catch the words, watched Sakura hover nearby with wide eyes and 100 questions visibly building behind them, watched Sasuke's expression settle into something unreadable that was neither dismissive nor entirely comfortable. It was, Tsunade thought, exactly the kind of thing that could not be allowed to sit uninvestigated. Not with a boy this untrained carrying something with that kind of raw restraining power, something that in the wrong hands, wielded without discipline, could just as easily crush as catch. She stayed in the tree line until the drill ended and the 3 genin dispersed toward home, until only Kakashi remained on the field, arms crossed, looking not at the empty clearing but directly at the tree line where she had been standing the entire time. "You can come out," Kakashi called, without raising his voice. "I recognized the chakra signature about 10 minutes ago. Took me a while to believe it." Tsunade stepped out from the shade with the particular unhurried confidence of a woman who had never in her life needed to apologize for where she chose to stand, and found herself looking at a masked shinobi whose single visible eye had gone carefully, deliberately guarded. "We should talk," she said. "Yes," Kakashi agreed. "I think we probably should." Chapter 7. They talked on the empty training field, standing several careful paces apart, 2 people who each had reasons of their own for approaching this conversation with more caution than the situation strictly required. "Lady Tsunade," Kakashi said, once the last of his students had rounded the corner out of sight. "I confess I did not expect to find you watching my genin train. I did not expect to be here either." She said it flatly, without apology. "Your student collapsed alone in a training clearing 2 nights ago from something that started as chakra exhaustion and ended up looking like considerably more than that. I found him. I've been keeping an eye on his recovery since." Something shifted behind Kakashi's mask, a fraction of tension easing that told her he had genuinely not known about the collapse at all. "He didn't mention that. He wouldn't. He struck me as the type who'd rather die than admit weakness in front of people whose opinion he actually cares about. She watched that land, watched Kakashi's jaw tighten slightly in a way that suggested she had guessed correctly about more than she intended. What did you know about the chains? Nothing, Kakashi admitted. I knew his mother's clan had bloodline capabilities beyond Fuinjutsu mastery. I did not know he had any of it in him. As far as I know, no one currently in this village knew, or if someone did, they never told me, and there are only a handful of people I could imagine keeping that particular secret. Danzo, Tsunade said, and watched the name land like a stone dropped into still water. Possibly. The Hokage might know more than I do. I'd rather not speculate beyond that. Kakashi's visible eye studied her with an intensity that belied his usual lazy posture. What I want to know is why the legendary slug Sannin, who has not set foot in this village in over a decade, happened to be conveniently nearby the exact night my students' chakra network decided to reveal something no one was prepared for. Coincidence, Tsunade said, and even she heard how thin it sounded. Kakashi did not push it, which she appreciated more than she let show. Instead he crossed his arms and looked out at the empty field where, an hour earlier, a 12-year-old had accidentally deployed a technique capable of restraining a tailed beast in order to save a teammate from a falling log. His control is non-existent, Kakashi said. That's the immediate problem. Whatever that was, it fired without his conscious intent, cost him almost nothing to activate, and could just as easily have crushed Sakura's spine as saved her if the angle had been different by a few degrees. Agreed. Tsunade's voice had gone into the clipped, clinical register she used when a diagnosis had solidified into something actionable. Left alone, that kind of dormant expression usually does one of two things. It either stays buried, inert, waiting for a crisis intense enough to force it out again with no more control than it had today. Or it surfaces gradually, badly, through exactly the kind of uncontrolled burst you just watched, each one more dangerous than the last as his reserves and raw power continue to grow faster than his ability to manage them. And the third option, someone teaches him properly. Now, before the Chunin Exams put him in front of opponents who will exploit an unstable ability the second they notice it, and before his own reserves outgrow whatever fragile control he currently has by accident. Kakashi was quiet for a moment, weighing something she could not fully read behind that mask. Your offering. I'm considering it. Which was, Tsunade knew even as she said it, already something close to a lie of omission, because some part of her had made the decision back in that in-room watching a boy eat breakfast like the world had never once been unkind to him. I need to speak with the Hokage. Officially this time, not from a tree line. He'll want to know why, Kakashi said. Everyone will want to know why. There are people in this village who'll see a Sannin taking sudden interest in the container of the 9 tails and draw conclusions you may not enjoy. Let them draw whatever conclusions they want. Something hard settled into her voice, old and familiar, the particular steel that had once made her one of the most feared shinobi of her generation long before medicine ever entered the picture. I've buried people I love to protect this village's future, Kakashi. I don't much care what anyone thinks of an old woman deciding a kid deserves better than being left to figure out something this dangerous entirely on his own. Kakashi studied her for a long moment, and whatever he found in her expression seemed to settle something in him, because the wariness in his posture eased, just slightly, into something closer to cautious relief. I'll arrange the meeting, he said. Lord Third will want to hear this from you directly. Good, Tsunade said. Because I intend to be very direct. Chapter 8. The meeting with the Hokage would take a few days to arrange properly, Kakashi had said, given how carefully certain conversations needed to be handled in a village with ears and more corners than most people realized. Tsunade decided she was not going to waste those days waiting. She found Naruto the next morning at a training ground closer to the village center, the ordinary daylight kind rather than his usual midnight haunt, practicing what was clearly meant to be a controlled release of chakra, and clearly was not. He was trying, she could tell, to deliberately summon the same golden thread that had saved Sakura the day before, and failing over and over with the increasingly frustrated persistence of someone who did not yet understand that raw effort could not substitute for actual technique. You're doing that wrong, Tsunade said, announcing herself. Naruto spun around, startled, then broke into a grin at the sight of her that was frankly a little too pleased for someone who had only known her 3 days. Granny Tsunade! Did you see that thing I did yesterday? With the chain? Kakashi-sensei wouldn't tell me anything about it, just said we talk about it later, which is what adults say when they don't actually want to explain something. That's usually accurate. She settled onto a nearby stump, arms crossed, and studied him with the frank assessing look of someone deciding exactly how much truth a student had earned yet. What you did yesterday is called a chakra chain. It runs in your mother's family. It's rare, it's powerful, and right now it is also completely uncontrolled, which makes it about as dangerous to you as it is to whatever it's aimed at. My mom's family, Naruto repeated slowly, and something in his face went carefully still in a way that made Tsunade's chest ache with an old, familiar sympathy. I don't really know anything about my mom. Or my dad. Nobody ever. I know, Tsunade said, gently enough that it cut through whatever defensive joke he was gearing up to make instead. That's not a conversation for today. Today I'm offering to teach you how to control what surfaced yesterday before it surfaces again somewhere it can actually hurt someone. His eyes went wide. You'd teach me? Just like that? Just like that. She held up a hand before he could launch into what looked like it was about to be an enthusiastic and lengthy expression of gratitude. It won't be easy, and it won't be fun most of the time, and I expect you to actually listen instead of charging at every problem like you can outstubborn it. Deal? Deal. He said it so fast and so loudly that a pair of birds startled out of the nearest tree. They spent the next 2 hours on nothing more glamorous than chakra sensing exercises, learning to feel the difference between the fox's presence, his own ordinary reserves, and the thin, distinct thread of the chain ability layered somewhere beneath both. It was slow, unglamorous work, exactly the kind Naruto usually avoided in favor of louder, flashier training, and to his credit he stuck with it with a focus that surprised her. During a break, sitting in the shade with water bottles between them, he asked the question she had been half expecting since the moment she agreed to any of this. Why do you actually care so much? You're some famous traveling medic, right? You could be anywhere. Why spend your time on some random genin's weird chakra problem? Tsunade looked out at the training field for a long moment before answering, weighing how much of the truth the boy who had known her for 3 days deserved. I had a little brother once, she said finally. Nawaki. He wanted to be Hokage more than anything in the world, talked about it constantly, drove everyone around him half crazy with how loud he was about it. He died on a mission before he ever got the chance to try. I had someone else too, later, a man named Dan, who wanted the same thing for entirely his own reasons. I lost him too, trying to save someone else on a battlefield that should have been survivable and wasn't. Her voice stayed level, professional, the tone of someone who had told this story enough times to armor it, though something underneath the words was not armored at all. For a long time after that, medicine felt like a language I'd forgotten how to speak. Every patient reminded me of every patient I'd failed to save. That's why you left the village, Naruto said quietly. It was not a question. That's why I left the village. She met his eyes steady. And then I found some idiot kid passed out in a training clearing with a chakra network that shouldn't exist, working himself half to death trying to become strong enough to matter to people who already should have seen it in him. And something in me that I thought had gone quiet a long time ago decided it wasn't done yet. Naruto did not say anything clever back. He just looked at her for a long moment with an expression far too solemn for his usual face, and then he nodded, once, like something important had just been agreed to between them without either of them needing to say it out loud. I'm not going to die on some battlefield, he said. I'm going to be Hokage. And I'm going to protect everyone who matters to me while I do it. I believe you, Tsunade said, and found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she meant it completely. Chapter 9. Word traveled through Konoha's shadows differently than it traveled through its markets and tea houses, quieter, slower to surface, but no less thorough for the delay. It took 3 days for a report to reach the one man in the village whose entire organization existed for the purpose of knowing things before any one official decided he was allowed to. Danzo read the report twice, standing alone in the bare, undecorated room that served as his office, and did not react outwardly at all, which was, for those who knew him, its own kind of reaction. A masked operative knelt at the doorway, having delivered the summary in the flat, affectless voice that Root trained into all of its members from childhood. The slug Sannin has remained in the village 3 days beyond her initial arrival. She has been observed twice near the Uzumaki boys' training locations. Sharingan Kakashi met with her privately on the 2nd day. No official notification has reached the Hokage's office as of this report. And the boy Danzo said? What was observed? A chakra discharge consistent with restraint techniques. Unconfirmed bloodline origin. The operative present described it as, in his words, a chain. Danzo's single visible eye narrowed by a fraction, the only outward sign of the calculation now moving rapidly behind it. He had suspected, for years, in the careful and patient way he suspected most things, that Kushina Uzumaki's clan carried more than sealing talent in its blood. He had never confirmed it, and confirmation without opportunity was worth very little. A dormant bloodline surfacing now, in the container of the 9 tails, on the eve of a Chunin exam that would place the boy under the scrutiny of foreign villages and their intelligence networks alike, was either a catastrophic security risk, or the single greatest asset currently sitting unclaimed inside Konoha's walls, depending entirely on who ended up shaping it. He did not intend to let that shaping fall entirely to a Sannin who had spent a decade demonstrating exactly how little regard she held for the village's chain of command. Continue surveillance, he said. Discreetly. I want to know the full extent of what Tsunade is teaching him, and I want to know before the Hokage's office formalizes anything with her presence here. And if she discovers the surveillance, she will not. Danzo's voice carried the flat certainty of a man who had spent 40 years building an intelligence apparatus specifically designed to remain invisible to people far more paranoid than one exiled Sannin distracted by an unexpected reunion with old sentiment. Report daily. If the boy's ability develops to a point where it represents genuine value to this village's future security, I will decide then whether informal instruction from a wandering medic is an adequate framework for cultivating it. The operative bowed and vanished without another word, and Danzo remained alone in his office a while longer, turning the report over in his mind with the patience of a man for whom timelines measured in years were entirely comfortable. He had watched the 9 tails container grow up from a careful, deliberate distance for 12 years. Weighing at various points whether the boy represented a weapon worth shaping directly or a liability best managed quietly and unremarked upon. The chain revelation shifted that calculation meaningfully. A bloodline capable of restraining tailed beasts, awakening naturally in the one shinobi already carrying one, was not the kind of asset a village could afford to leave in the hands of sentiment and improvisation. He did not move yet. Moving too early, before the shape of the situation had fully revealed itself, was the kind of mistake amateurs made. But he began, that same evening, quietly redirecting a handful of resources toward a question he intended to have answered well before the Chunin exams began: whether Naruto Uzumaki's chains, properly cultivated, might prove useful enough to be worth the greater project he had been patiently building in the shadows for far longer than anyone in the Hokage's office suspected. Across the village, unaware entirely of the report now sitting in a drawer in an undecorated office, Naruto fell asleep that night with his hands aching from hours of chakra control exercises, and dreamed, for the first time in longer than he could remember, of a woman with red hair he had never actually seen, standing somewhere just beyond the edge of a dream he could not quite hold onto when he woke. Chapter 10. The Hokage's office looked exactly as Tsunade remembered it, which was somehow both comforting and faintly irritating, as though the room itself had refused to age on principle while everything else in her life kept moving forward without her permission. Hiruzen Sarutobi rose from behind his desk the moment Kakashi showed her in, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all, 2 old shinobi taking the measure of years that had not been kind to either of them in quite the same ways. Tsunade, Hiruzen said finally, warmth and wariness braided together in his voice in roughly equal measure. It has been a very long time. Too long for pleasantries, old man. Sit down. We have things to discuss that aren't going to fix themselves with tea and small talk. He sat, and gestured for her to do the same, and Kakashi took up a quiet post near the door, present but deliberately unobtrusive, the way he handled most conversations that were not strictly his to lead. Tsunade laid it out plainly, the way she laid out every diagnosis she had ever delivered, without softening the parts that deserved no softening. The collapse in the training clearing. The chakra network repairing itself faster than any medical precedent she knew of. The layered signature beneath the fox's chakra that she now believed, with reasonable confidence, to be a dormant expression of the Uzumaki chain bloodline, awakened prematurely and without any framework of control. The incident with the falling log. Her offer, already extended and already accepted, to begin correcting that lack of control before it corrected itself in some far more dangerous fashion during the Chunin Exams. Hiruzen listened without interrupting, his expression growing more troubled with every detail, until by the end he sat with his pipe unlit and forgotten in his hand, staring at a middle distance that had nothing to do with the room around him. "Kushina," he said quietly, when Tsunade finished. "I suspected once that her clan carried more than sealing skill. She never spoke of it directly. I never pressed. There seemed no reason to, given how carefully we were already protecting the fact of what Naruto carries." "There's reason now," Tsunade said. "An uncontrolled bloodline in a boy about to enter a tournament that will put him in front of shinobi from every major village, all of whom will be watching for exactly this kind of exploitable weakness. Left as is, it's a liability. Trained properly, in the time we actually have before the exams, it could become one of the genuine strengths carrying him through them. You're proposing to train him yourself." "I already have been, informally, for the better part of a week. I'm here to make it formal, and to make sure nobody in this village decides my presence near him is a problem worth interfering with." Something hard entered her voice on that last part, a warning aimed less at Hiruzen himself and more at everyone she suspected had already begun watching from a careful distance. Hiruzen's gaze flicked briefly toward Kakashi, who offered nothing beyond a slight, knowing tilt of his head, before returning to Tsunade with an expression that had settled, somewhere in the last several minutes, into something closer to relief than concern. "I would be a fool to refuse the offer of the fifth candidate herself personally training the boy," he said. "Selfishly, I've worried for years that I lacked the specific expertise to guide whatever he might one day inherit from his mother's side. I am glad, more than I can easily say, that someone finally has." "There will be complications," Kakashi said from the doorway, speaking for the first time since the meeting began. "Danzo will hear about this eventually, if he hasn't already. He's shown interest in Naruto before, quietly, in ways that never quite crossed the line worth formally addressing." "Let him hear," Tsunade said. "Let him do whatever he thinks he's entitled to do about it. I did not come back to this village to ask anyone's permission for how I choose to spend my time, and I am not going to start now over something this important." Hiruzen studied her for a long moment, something almost fond flickering across his weathered face. "You sound exactly like you did 30 years ago." "I feel considerably older than I did 30 years ago," Tsunade said dryly, "but I appreciate the compliment regardless." They settled the practical details quickly after that, training schedules that would not interfere with Team 7's remaining preparation time, a quiet agreement that the specifics of what Naruto carried would remain within this room and Kakashi's discretion rather than reaching the wider council, and a shared, unspoken understanding among all three of them that whatever Danzo eventually chose to do with the information now circulating through his own channels, they intended to be ready for it. Tsunade left the tower an hour later with something she had not expected to feel again after all these years of running, something that felt uncomfortably, unmistakably like purpose settling back into a chest that had spent a very long time convincing itself it had none left to spare. Chapter 11. The days that followed fell into a rhythm neither Tsunade nor Naruto had expected to enjoy quite as much as they did. Mornings belonged to Kakashi and the rest of Team 7, standard drills and sparring and the slow grinding work of preparing 3 genin for an exam that would test considerably more than raw strength. Afternoons belonged to Tsunade, and those hours looked nothing like standard training at all. She started him on chakra scalpel theory before she ever let him touch the chains again, insisting that understanding how to guide fine threads of chakra with surgical precision would matter more to his control than any amount of raw power drilling. He hated it for the first 2 days, complained bitterly that it felt more like being a nurse than a ninja, and then, on the 3rd day, produced a scalpel thread steady enough to slice a falling leaf clean down its center vein without tearing the rest, and stopped complaining entirely. Chakra is chakra, Tsunade told him, watching him practice with the fierce, focused concentration he brought to everything once he actually decided it mattered. Whether it's healing a wound or forming a chain sharp enough to bind a tailed beast, it obeys the same fundamental rules. Control the small things first. The big things get easier once your hands understand what they're actually doing. They moved to the chains themselves on the 5th day, and here Tsunade proceeded with a caution that surprised even her, since caution had never been her most natural instinct. She had him summon a single thread, no longer than his forearm, and hold it steady for as long as he could manage, over and over, correcting his breathing and his focus each time it flickered or snapped early. It was slow. It was, by Naruto's own repeated complaints, mind-numbingly boring compared to anything flashy. But by the end of the first week the thread held for a full 10 seconds without wavering, then 15, and by the second week he could summon and dismiss it at will, a controlled length of golden chakra chain forming from his forearm and dissolving again on command with a precision that would have been remarkable in a shinobi twice his age. Sasuke noticed the change first, the way he noticed most things about his teammates, with a sharp, assessing attention he rarely bothered voicing out loud. He caught Naruto during one of the rare afternoons that overlapped with team training, watching him hold a length of chain steady through a full minute of Kakashi's deliberate distractions without breaking focus once. "You've gotten better," Sasuke said, which from him counted as a substantial concession. "Been training," Naruto said, with a shrug that did not fully hide how pleased the comment made him. "With who?" Naruto hesitated, glancing briefly toward the tree line where Tsunade was not currently standing but often was. "Someone who knows what she's doing. That's all I'm allowed to say for now." Sasuke studied him a moment longer, something unreadable moving behind his dark eyes, and then simply nodded and returned to his own drills, though Naruto noticed, over the following days, that his teammates' attention lingered on him more often than it used to, less dismissive and more genuinely curious, in a way that felt like its own quiet kind of progress. Sakura noticed too, in her own way, cornering Naruto after training one afternoon with the particular directness she reserved for questions she had clearly been sitting on for a while. "You've been different lately," she said. "Focused. Actually listening when Kakashi-sensei corrects your form instead of just doing your own thing anyway." "People can change, you know," Naruto said, grinning, though there was less bravado in it than there once might have been. "I know." She studied him a moment, something warmer than usual in her expression. "It's a good change." By the final week before the exam, Tsunade began layering the chains together with the broader chakra control work, teaching him to weave 2 threads simultaneously, then 3, watching with a critical, professional eye that gradually, grudgingly, gave way to something closer to open pride as he cleared benchmark after benchmark faster than she had privately expected. "You're going to walk into that exam with something none of your opponents will see coming," she told him, during their final session before the registration deadline, watching him dismiss a trio of steady chains with clean, practiced control. "That's not nothing, Naruto. That's the difference between a genin who gets overwhelmed the first time something goes wrong and a genin who adapts." "Because of you," he said, quieter than his usual volume. "Because you put the work in," she said, when it would have been easier not to. "I just gave you the tools." She reached out and, with an awkwardness that surprised her, ruffled his hair the way she vaguely remembered doing to Nawaki once, a lifetime ago. "Go get some rest. You've got an exam to walk into tomorrow, and I expect you to make it interesting." "I always make things interesting," Naruto said, grinning, and for once Tsunade did not have it in her to argue with him. Chapter 12. The morning of registration arrived gray and cool, the kind of early autumn light that made the whole village look softer around its edges than it usually did. Naruto stood outside the academy building where the exam would formally begin, headband freshly polished, and felt something settle in his chest that had not been there 2 weeks earlier, a quiet, steady confidence that had nothing to do with volume or bravado and everything to do with hours of unglamorous, patient work. Sakura arrived first, offering him a small smile that had grown more genuine over the past weeks, followed shortly by Sasuke, whose nod carried the particular weight of someone who had, in his own quiet way, started counting Naruto as a teammate worth taking seriously rather than simply tolerating. Kakashi found them a few minutes before the doors opened, hands in his pockets, visible eye crinkled in the shape it made when he was pleased about something he had no intention of stating outright. "Ready? Ready," all three said, more or less in unison, and Kakashi's small huff of amusement suggested that was, in its own way, exactly the answer he had been hoping to hear. From the shade of a nearby building, far enough back to avoid drawing attention but close enough to watch clearly, Tsunade stood with her arms crossed and Shizen quiet at her shoulder, observing the small knot of genin filing toward the academy doors with an expression she did not bother hiding, since there was no one nearby who mattered enough to hide it from. "You could go say goodbye," Shizen said. "Wish him luck properly." "He doesn't need luck," Tsunade said. "He's got 2 weeks of actual work behind him now instead of just stubbornness. That'll carry him further than luck would." "You're staying then?" "Through the exam." Tsunade did not answer immediately, watching the doors swing shut behind the last of the genin filing inside, watching the ordinary morning traffic of the village continue around that single closed door as though nothing significant had just happened, though she suspected, somewhere down in the part of her that had learned long ago to trust instinct over evidence, that something significant very much had. "I've got unfinished business here," she said finally. "A boy with an unstable bloodline that's only had 2 weeks of proper guidance instead of the years it actually needs. An old man in that tower who's clearly been quietly worried about exactly the situation I just walked into the middle of. And a one-eyed man across the village who I'd bet good money has already started asking questions he has no business asking about a 12-year-old's chakra network." "Danzo," Shizen said quietly. "Danzo," Tsunade confirmed, and something cold and watchful entered her expression, the particular readiness of someone who had spent decades learning to recognize when a quiet situation was about to stop being quiet. "I don't know yet what he's planning to do with what he's learned. But I intend to be here to find out, and to make sure whatever it is, it doesn't happen to that kid without someone in his corner who's actually paying attention." Shizen studied her mentor for a long moment, taking in the set of her jaw, the steadiness that had crept back into her posture over the last 2 weeks in a way Shizen had not seen in years of traveling together. "You've changed too, you know. Since we found him." "Don't start," Tsunade said, though there was no real heat in it. "I'm just saying. It's good to see." Tsunade did not answer that directly, only turned to watch the academy building a moment longer, imagining, somewhere behind those closed doors, a boy with an unfinished bloodline and an unstoppable amount of stubborn heart sitting down to face the first real test of everything they had built together in 2 short weeks. Beyond him, beyond the walls of the exam room itself, she could feel the edges of larger things already beginning to gather, quiet movements in a village that never stayed quiet for long, an old enemy's patient attention now turned toward a boy who had no idea he had already become worth watching this closely. Whatever came next, she thought, she was not going anywhere until she saw it through. The academy doors stayed closed behind them, and somewhere on the far side of the village, in a room with no windows and no decoration at all, a report was already being written about exactly how far a certain genin's new training had progressed, and exactly what a patient, careful man intended to do about it once the right moment finally arrived. Act 2 Act 2 Chapter 1 The academy classroom set aside for the first stage of the Chunin Exams was colder than Naruto remembered it being as a student, or maybe that was just nerves talking. Rows of desks stretched out under fluorescent light, packed with genin from villages he had never seen represented in Konoha before, forehead protectors from Suna, Kirigakure, Aim, Kusa, all of it pressed together into a room that smelled like pencil shavings and barely contained anxiety. Ibiki Marino stood at the front of the room looking like a man who enjoyed his job in ways that were probably not entirely healthy, and explained the rules of the written test with the flat, unhurried menace of someone who had delivered the same speech to 100 different classes of terrified 12-year-olds. 10 questions. A point deduction system. A 10th question that would only be revealed after the first 9 were finished, and a warning, delivered almost casually, that failing that final question carried consequences worse than simple disqualification. Naruto looked down at question 1 and felt his stomach drop somewhere around his knees. He did not understand it. He did not understand question 2 either, or 3, and by the time he had scanned all 9 written questions his overwhelming impression was that someone had handed him a Jonin-level exam and expected a genin to somehow muddle through it using pure force of will. Except, he had spent 2 weeks now learning, really learning, from someone who did not accept half-effort as an acceptable outcome. 2 weeks of chakra scalpel drills and chain control had taught him something he had not expected training like that to teach him at all, which was patience, and the willingness to sit with a problem that looked impossible until some smaller, more manageable piece of it revealed itself. He could not answer the questions. But he could watch, carefully, the way the entire room had gone tense and quiet with the specific tension of people trying not to look like they were cheating while cheating constantly, teams passing information back and forth through techniques designed to escape detection, and he understood, slowly, the way Tsunade had taught him to understand a difficult chakra pattern by not staring straight at it but letting his awareness spread wide instead. This was not a test of what he knew. It was a test of what he was willing to risk finding out. He spent the next hour doing what he did best, which was refusing to give up, using every scrap of instinct and stubbornness to piece together fragments of information from what he could observe without directly copying anyone's paper, filling in answers that were maybe a third correct and entirely his own effort. When Ibiki finally reached the 10th question, and delivered his speech about the stakes of choosing to answer it, and teams began raising their hands in 2s and 3s to withdraw entirely rather than risk the consequences he was describing, Naruto felt something harden in his chest that had nothing to do with strategy, and everything to do with the 2 weeks he had just spent learning that giving up was never actually the safer option. Not really, not for the things that mattered. He stood up before he had fully decided to. "I don't care what the risk is," he said, loud enough that half the room turned to look at him. "I'm not quitting. Not here, not ever, no matter what dumb rule you put in front of me. Being a ninja isn't about avoiding risk. It's about deciding what's worth the risk in the first place." The room went very quiet. Ibiki studied him for a long moment with an expression that gave away nothing, and Naruto braced for whatever came next, half expecting to be humiliated in front of everyone for making a scene. Instead, something in the big scarred man's face shifted, almost imperceptibly, into something that might have been approval. "Congratulations," Ibiki said to the room at large. There was no 10th question. There never was. The real test was whether you were willing to make a decision under pressure with incomplete information and stand behind it. All of you who stayed just passed. The room erupted into a mixture of relief and confusion, and Sakura, 2 rows over, caught Naruto's eye with an expression of pure exasperated affection that suggested she had known that whole time he had no idea what he was actually doing and was proud of him anyway. Sasuke, beside her, said nothing, but the look he gave Naruto carried a weight that had not been there 2 weeks earlier, something closer to genuine respect than the careful tolerance he usually managed. Kakashi, waiting for them outside once the results were confirmed, took one look at his 3 students and allowed himself a small, satisfied smile that vanished almost as quickly as it appeared. "Stage 1 complete," he said. "Get some rest tonight. Stage 2 starts tomorrow, and it will not be nearly as forgiving as a room full of pencils and paper." Chapter 2. Training Ground 44 looked exactly as ominous as its nickname promised. A wall of dense, ancient trees ringed by chain-link fencing that seemed almost insultingly inadequate given the sounds occasionally drifting out from somewhere deep inside the canopy. Anko Mitarashi paced in front of the assembled genin with the manic energy of someone who genuinely loved her job, explaining the rules of the survival exercise with a relish that made several teams visibly pale. 2 scrolls, heaven and earth, 1 per team, obtained by any means necessary from opposing teams inside the forest, both required to reach the central tower within 5 days. "People die in there," Anko said cheerfully, as though this were the most reassuring fact in the world rather than the least. "Last year we lost about 1/10 of the field. Try not to be part of that 10th. Naruto adjusted the strap on his gear and glanced at his teammates. Sakura's jaw was set with determination, a kunai already loose in her hand. Sasuke's expression had settled into the flat, focused calm he wore before serious fights, the kind that made him look older than his actual age. "Stick together," Sasuke said, low enough that only the 2 of them could hear. "No matter what happens in there. We stick together." It was such an un-Sasuke thing to say, so uncharacteristically collaborative for someone who had spent most of the last several years treating teamwork as a concession rather than a strategy, that Naruto almost missed the significance of it entirely. Almost. Yeah, he said instead, and meant it more fully than he had meant most things in his life. No matter what. The gates opened, and Team 7 moved into the forest. The canopy swallowed the sunlight almost immediately, replacing the open sky with a dense green ceiling that let through only thin, scattered shafts of light, and the ground beneath their feet grew softer, wetter, thick with roots that seemed to reach for ankles with an almost deliberate persistence. Sounds carried strangely in here, distant screeches and rustles that could have been animals or could have been something considerably worse, and every member of the team moved with the particular tension of people who understood, viscerally now rather than abstractly, exactly how many things in this forest wanted them dead or worse. They found a defensible position within the first hour, a hollow beneath an enormous root system that offered decent cover in 3 directions, and Sasuke crouched at the entrance keeping watch while Sakura pulled out the notes she had made on likely scroll locations based on patterns from previous exams. If we're going to find a team with the scroll we need, she said, we should focus on teams that look strong but overconfident. They're more likely to be careless. Or we could focus on teams that look weak, Naruto said. Easier fight. Except if they look weak and made it this far anyway, that usually means they're hiding something, Sasuke said, without looking away from the treeling. Strong teams are predictable. Weak-looking teams that survive the first stage are the ones you actually have to worry about. Naruto absorbed that with the particular attentiveness he had started bringing to lessons lately, filing it away next to the growing collection of things Tsunade had spent 2 weeks teaching him about patience and observation mattering as much as raw force. They moved out an hour later, tracking a faint disturbance in the underbrush that Sasuke's sharp eyes had picked up from a distance, and found themselves, within a few careful minutes of tracking, looking down into a small clearing where 3 genin from a village Naruto did not immediately recognize were arguing in low, tense voices about which direction to head next. Grass shinobi, Sasuke murmured. I don't recognize the forehead protector design. Something about the way one of them stood, unnaturally still even in the middle of an argument with the others, made the back of Naruto's neck prickle in a way that had nothing to do with normal caution and everything to do with the specific chakra-sensing awareness Tsunade had spent 2 weeks drilling into him. He could not have explained it precisely. He only knew, with sudden bone-deep certainty, that something about that stillness was wrong in a way that went far beyond an unfamiliar village's forehead protector. Something's off about that one, he whispered. Sasuke followed his gaze, studying the grass genin with the same sharpened attention. The one in the middle? Yeah. Naruto's chain instincts, still new and half understood, prickled faintly along his forearm, an unfamiliar warning sensation he had not felt outside of training. I don't know what it is. But we should be careful. Sakura looked between them, reading the sudden tension in both their postures, and quietly ready to connive without needing to be told twice. None of them moved to engage. All 3 simply watched, from the shadow of the underbrush, as the grass team finished their low argument and turned, as one, to head deeper into the forest, and Naruto found himself watching that unnaturally still genin's back long after the trio had vanished from sight, unable to entirely shake the feeling that whatever had just walked past them had been considerably more dangerous than 3 ordinary genin arguing over directions. Chapter 3. The attack, when it came without warning, which Naruto would later realize was exactly the point. They had made camp for the night in a shallow cave mouth, taking turns keeping watch, and it was during Sasuke's shift, an hour before dawn, that the air around their camp went suddenly, wrongly heavy, thick with a killing intent so dense it felt almost physical, like trying to breathe underwater. Naruto woke instantly, every instinct screaming, and found himself looking at a massive snake coiled around the cave mouth, and beyond it, standing with an ease that made the hair on his arms stand up, the same unnaturally still grass genin from the day before. Except it was not a genin at all. Naruto understood that within seconds, watching the way the figure moved, the way the killing intent radiating off it did not feel like anything a person that age should have been capable of producing. Such interesting children, the figure said, in a voice that did not match the body it was coming from, low and sibilant, and old in a way that had nothing to do with actual age. I only meant to observe. But I find myself curious about one of you in particular. Yellow eyes, slitted like a snake's, fixed directly on Naruto, and something in that gaze felt like being weighed, catalogued, filed away as a specimen of interest rather than regarded as a person at all. Who are you? Sasuke demanded, already moving into a defensive stance in front of Sakura. Names matter so little between strangers, the figure said, and smiled in a way that showed too many teeth. But since you'll want something to scream later, you may call me Orochimaru. The name meant nothing to Naruto in the moment, but he felt Sasuke go rigid beside him, some old fear or old knowledge surfacing behind dark eyes that had gone suddenly, uncharacteristically wide. Orochimaru moved before any of them could react properly, a blur of speed that outmatched anything Naruto had trained against, and the fight that followed was less a fight than a series of increasingly desperate attempts to simply survive contact with something operating on an entirely different level of ability. Sakura was thrown clear within the first exchange, slamming hard into a tree trunk and sliding to the ground stunned but breathing. Sasuke fared marginally better, landing 2 clean hits with kunai that should have drawn blood and instead seemed to pass through afterimages that dissolved the instant they connected. Naruto felt the chain instinct flare in his arm before he consciously decided to use it, the same unstable, half-controlled sensation from the training ground weeks earlier, and threw himself between Orochimaru and Sasuke's exposed back on pure reflex, a thin thread of golden chakra lashing out to intercept a strike aimed squarely for Sasuke's spine. It worked mostly. The chain deflected the blow enough that Sasuke stumbled clear instead of taking a killing hit, though the force of the deflection sent Naruto sprawling hard against the cave wall, breath knocked entirely out of him. Orochimaru's slitted eyes widened, genuine surprise flickering across a face that seemed otherwise incapable of honest expression. A chain, he murmured, almost to himself, something hungry and delighted entering his voice in a way that made Naruto's skin crawl worse than the killing intent had. How fascinating. The Uzumaki bloodline, awakened in the fox's own container. I did not expect that particular combination. He knows what it is, Naruto thought, dazed, still trying to get air back into lungs that did not want to cooperate. He knows what I am. Orochimaru did not press the advantage against Naruto, not immediately, his attention instead sliding, almost lazily, back towards Sasuke, who had scrambled upright and put himself squarely between the attacker and both his teammates despite clearly being outmatched by an order of magnitude. Uchiha, Orochimaru said, and something in his tone shifted into an entirely different register, hungrier and more focused than the interest he had shown Naruto. Yes. You'll do very nicely indeed. What happened next took less than 2 seconds. Orochimaru's neck stretched, impossibly, grotesquely, closing the distance to Sasuke's shoulder faster than any of them could react, and then Sasuke was screaming, a sound Naruto had never heard from him before and hoped never to hear again, as something dark and mark-shaped spread outward from a bite wound on his neck. Naruto lunged forward, chain flaring wild and uncontrolled along his arm, but Orochimaru was already retreating, already dissolving into the shadows of the forest with a parting laugh that seemed to echo from everywhere, and nowhere at once. Find me again, chain boy, when you're ready to be tested properly, his voice said, from somewhere among the trees that had already gone empty and quiet. I have a feeling we'll meet again sooner than you think. Then the forest was silent except for Sasuke's ragged breathing and Sakura's frightened voice calling both their names, and Naruto knelt beside his teammate in the churned dirt of the cave mouth, one hand hovering uselessly over the black, spreading mark on Sasuke's neck, feeling more powerless than he had felt since the night his own chakra network had first betrayed him in a training clearing weeks ago. Chapter 4. Sasuke's fever broke sometime after dawn, though it left him pale and shaking, dark marks retreating partway back into the bite wound at his neck like something merely resting rather than gone. Sakura had done what she could with the basic field medical training the academy provided, cleaning the wound, keeping him hydrated, wrapping a strip of cloth over the mark itself as though hiding it might somehow lessen whatever it had done. We need to get him to the tower, she said, voice tight with barely controlled fear. Now. Whatever that thing did to him, it's not something bandages fix. Naruto nodded, still shaken himself, replaying the fight over and over in his head and finding no version of it where he had done enough. The chain had worked, barely, enough to save Sasuke from a killing blow, but it had done nothing against the actual attack that mattered, nothing to stop whatever poison or curse now sat coiled beneath his teammate's skin. They moved carefully through the forest for the rest of that day, Sasuke leaning heavily on Naruto's shoulder whenever the terrain grew rough, Sakura scouting ahead with a wariness that had sharpened considerably since the attack. Twice they crossed paths with other teams, and twice Sakura's careful reading of the situation, exactly the kind of pattern recognition she had talked about back in their hollow, let them avoid confrontations they had no strength left to win. It was on the second evening, exhausted and running low on options, that they found their opening. A team of 3 from Amigekure had made camp in a small clearing, and through careful observation Naruto could see the telltale shape of an earth scroll tucked into the lead genin's vest, the exact scroll they still needed to complete their own set. The 3 shinobi looked competent but not exceptional, tired from their own days in the forest, attention divided between keeping watch and managing what looked like an injury on one teammate's leg. "We could use clones," Naruto whispered, an idea forming with the particular clarity that came from 2 weeks of actually learning to think before charging in. Not to fight directly. To distract. Get them looking the wrong way long enough for one of us to grab the scroll clean. Sakura's eyebrows rose, surprised approval flickering across her tired face. "That's actually a good plan." "I have good plans sometimes," Naruto said, with a flash of his usual grin that looked strange against how drawn and worried his face had been for the last 2 days. It worked better than any of them expected. 3 clones drew the AIM team's attention toward the treeline on the clearing's far side, staging a loud, clumsy approach that read exactly like an inexperienced genin making a mistake, and while all 3 defenders turned to deal with the apparent threat, Sakura slipped in from the opposite direction with the quiet precision she had clearly been practicing on her own, lifted the scroll cleanly from the lead genin's vest, and vanished back into the underbrush before any of them realized what had happened. They regrouped a safe distance away, breathing hard, adrenaline and relief mixing together into something almost giddy despite everything. "We have both scrolls," Sakura said, disbelieving, holding heaven and earth side by side and shaking hands. "We actually have both scrolls." "Then let's move," Sasuke said, voice still rough but steadier than it had been, pushing himself upright with visible effort. "Before that mark decides to be a problem again." They reached the central tower with hours to spare before the 5-day deadline, and the moment they crossed the threshold into its shelter, Sasuke's legs finally gave out entirely, the accumulated strain of the mark and 2 days of walking wounded finally catching up all at once. Medical staff descended immediately, and Naruto stood back in the tower's entrance hall, watching his teammate carried away on a stretcher, feeling the same helpless fury he had felt in the cave mouth 2 nights earlier, that particular useless anger of being strong enough to survive something and not strong enough to actually prevent it. Kakashi found him there a few minutes later, expression grim beneath his usual mask of lazy unconcern. "He'll live," Kakashi said, without preamble, apparently reading the question on Naruto's face before he could ask it. "The mark is a problem we're going to need help managing." "But he'll live." "That thing," Naruto said. "Orochimaru." He knew about the chains. He called them the Uzumaki bloodline like it was something he'd been looking for. Something shifted behind Kakashi's visible eye, careful and calculating in a way that told Naruto this piece of information mattered considerably more than he currently understood. "We'll need to tell Lady Tsunade that immediately," Kakashi said. "And the Hokage. If Orochimaru has taken a personal interest in you, that changes things considerably." "Changes them how?" Kakashi did not answer right away, looking instead toward the medical wing where Sasuke had disappeared, expression unreadable. "It means," he said finally, "that whatever Danzo has been quietly investigating about you for the last 3 weeks just became the least dangerous person paying attention." Chapter 5. Danzo Shimura did not often request audiences with the Hokage. More often he simply appeared, unannounced, at moments calculated to catch his old rival off balance, and this evening was no exception, arriving at the tower office within an hour of the report reaching official channels that a Sannin believed to be Orochimaru had made direct contact with a Konoha genin team inside the Forest of Death. Hiruzen looked up from a desk covered in mission reports, and did not bother hiding his lack of enthusiasm at the interruption. Danzo. Hiruzen. Danzo's cane tapped once against the floor as he settled into the chair across the desk without waiting to be invited. I understand Orochimaru has surfaced. And that he took a particular interest in the Uzumaki boy. Word travels quickly. Word travels exactly as quickly as I ensure it does, in matters that concern the village's security. Danzo's single visible eye fixed on the Hokage with the flat, patient intensity that had unsettled shinobi far more senior than Genin for decades. A missing Nin S-class threat has confirmed knowledge of a dormant bloodline capability inside our Jinchuriki. That is no longer a matter that can remain confined to a wandering Sanin's informal training arrangement. Tsunade's training has produced exactly the kind of control that saved a teammate's life in that forest, Hiruzen said, voice carrying the particular steel he reserved for conversations he had clearly anticipated and prepared for. Without it, we would be having a very different conversation right now, likely involving considerably more casualties. I don't dispute the value of what she's accomplished. I question whether an informal arrangement, run at the discretion of one shinobi answering to no chain of command, is an adequate framework for managing an asset this significant, now that we know a rogue Sannin has taken personal interest in acquiring it. He is not an asset, Danzo. He is a 12-year-old boy who nearly lost his teammate to that same rogue Sannin 2 nights ago. He is both, Danzo said, without a trace of apology in his voice. Sentiment does not change what he represents to this village's future security, nor what he now represents as a target for every enemy who learns what Orochimaru learned in that forest. I am proposing formal root oversight of his continued development. Nothing more invasive than that. Hiruzen set down the report he had been holding with deliberate care, the kind of careful, controlled motion that in a younger man might have been a slammed fist instead. You proposed something similar 3 weeks ago, in slightly different language, and I declined it then. My answer has not changed. Circumstances have changed. Circumstances have confirmed that Tsunade's training is working exactly as intended, Hiruzen said. The boy survived a direct encounter with an S-class missing Nin using skills he did not possess a month ago. That is not an argument for removing his current instructor. It is the strongest possible argument for leaving her in place. Danzo's jaw tightened fractionally, the only outward sign of frustration he permitted himself. You are gambling this village's future on the good faith and continued presence of a woman who has spent a decade demonstrating exactly how little regard she holds for this village's chain of command. I am trusting the judgment of the strongest medical mind this village has ever produced, over a proposal to hand an unstable adolescent bloodline to an organization whose entire operating philosophy is built around treating children as tools rather than people. Hiruzen's voice had gone quiet, which from him was considerably more dangerous than volume would have been. You will not touch Root's involvement with that boy, Danzo. Not now, not after this conversation, and I will make my position on that matter formally documented before the council if you attempt to circumvent it. The two men regarded each other across the desk for a long, silent moment, decades of rivalry and mutual distrust settling into the space between them like something with physical weight. Very well, Danzo said finally, rising from his chair with the same unhurried precision with which he had arrived. I will respect the official position for now. But I would ask you to consider, Hiruzen, what happens the next time Orochimaru or someone like him decides that boy is worth taking rather than merely observing. Tsunade's training may be excellent. It will not stop an army. He left without waiting for a response, and Hiruzen sat alone in his office for a long while afterward, staring at the closed door, turning Danzo's parting words over in his mind with the particular unease of a man who suspected, uncomfortably, that they might contain more truth than he wanted to admit. Chapter 6. The preliminary matches were held in a wide underground arena beneath the tower, tiered balconies rising on all sides to hold the assembled genin, Jonin-sensei, and a scattering of official observers that included, to Naruto's mild surprise, Tsunade herself, arms crossed and expression unreadable in a shadowed corner of the observation deck. Sasuke had been cleared to compete despite the mark, though Kakashi hovered nearby with the particular watchfulness of a man ready to intervene at the first sign of trouble, a temporary sealing technique applied to keep the mark's influence contained during any exertion. The bracket was drawn by a large screen at the arena's center, names shuffling and resolving with mechanical indifference to the stakes involved, and Naruto felt his stomach tighten as his own name settled into the first match slot, paired against the Kirigakure genin he did not recognize, a wiry boy with bandages wrapped tight around both forearms and a chakra signature that read, even to Naruto's still developing sense, as something built around close-range speed rather than raw power. Uzumaki Naruto vs. Kaido Ranjaku, the proctor announced. Begin. The fight opened fast, the Kirigakure genin closing distance in a blur that would have caught most opponents flat-footed, twin short blades flashing out of the bandages on his forearms with a speed clearly meant to end the match in the first several seconds. 2 weeks earlier, it might have. Naruto's instincts, honed under 2 weeks of relentless drilling in chakra sensing and controlled deployment rather than raw brute force, caught the attack pattern half a second before it would have connected, and a single thin thread of golden chain lashed out to intercept the nearer blade, deflecting it wide with a precision that drew an audible murmur from the watching crowd. Kaito recovered quickly, pressing the assault with a series of rapid strikes designed to overwhelm through sheer volume rather than individual power, and Naruto found himself falling back on something he had spent considerably less time on than the chains themselves, but which came, in this moment, with surprising ease, weaving 2 separate threads simultaneously to form a shifting defensive lattice that turned aside strike after strike without ever fully committing to an attack of his own. "He's using the chains defensively," someone in the observation deck murmured, loud enough to carry down into the arena floor. "That's advanced control for a genin." Tsunade, watching from her shadowed corner, allowed herself the smallest, most private flicker of satisfaction, the particular pride of a teacher watching 2 weeks of unglamorous, patient drilling pay off in exactly the moment it mattered most. Naruto let the exchange continue for nearly a minute, absorbing the rhythm of his opponent's attacks, cataloging patterns the way Tsunade had taught him to catalog a chakra signature before committing to treatment, and when the opening finally came, a fractional overextension as Kaido committed to what he clearly intended as a finishing strike, Naruto moved. A single chain, longer and faster than anything he had deployed in training, snapped out and wrapped tight around Kaido's extended wrist, yanking him off balance with enough force to send him stumbling forward directly into the follow-up strike Naruto had already positioned himself to deliver, an open palm blow that connected clean and dropped his opponent flat against the arena floor, blades skittering away across the stone. The proctor moved in, checked Kaido's condition, and raised a hand. "Winner. Uzumaki Naruto." The applause that followed was not thunderous, but it was real, a scattering of genuine approval from a crowd that had watched a fight decided by genuine skill rather than luck, and Naruto climbed the stairs back to the waiting area feeling something he had rarely felt in his life, the particular quiet satisfaction of having earned something rather than simply survived it. Sakura met him at the top of the stairs with a grin that mixed pride and disbelief in roughly equal measure. "That was actually really good, Naruto. Like, genuinely good." "I've been training," he said, with a shrug that failed entirely to hide how pleased the comment made him. Kakashi, arriving a moment later with his usual unhurried gait, studied Naruto with an expression that mixed genuine approval and something more thoughtful underneath it. "That deflection sequence in the middle of the fight. The lattice formation. That's not something most jonin bother teaching this early, if they teach it at all. Granny Tsunade says defense is half of every fight. Nobody remembers to train properly," Naruto said. "Says most genin get so focused on hitting hard they forget getting hit less is usually the faster way to win." "She's not wrong," Kakashi said. "I'll admit I underestimated how much difference a month of her personal attention would make. You've grown into something considerably harder to predict than you were 3 weeks ago." Naruto grinned at that, some of the day's tension finally easing out of his shoulders, and allowed himself, for just a moment, to simply enjoy having earned praise from people whose opinion he genuinely valued rather than having to fight for scraps of grudging acknowledgement the way he usually did. From the observation deck above, a figure in a set of round spectacles adjusted his position slightly, watching Naruto's descent from the arena floor with an interest that had nothing to do with genuine admiration and everything to do with careful, clinical assessment. Kabuto Yakushi made a small note in the margin of a bingo book he carried everywhere, next to an entry that had, until very recently, contained considerably less detail than it now did. Chain bloodline confirmed, he wrote, in small precise handwriting. Combat application already exceeds expected genin baseline. Recommend continued observation. Lord Orochimaru will want the full report. He closed the book, adjusted his glasses, and turned his attention back to the arena floor, where the second match of the day was already being called, entirely unnoticed by anyone in the crowd around him except, perhaps, a woman in a shadowed corner whose gaze had briefly, sharply, flicked toward him and then away again, filing his presence away for consideration later. Chapter 7. Sasuke's match was called 3 fights later, against a Konoha genin named Yoroi Akadu, whose reputation, whispered through the observation deck in the minutes before the match began, centered on an unusual chakra absorption technique that let him drain an opponent's reserves through direct contact. Naruto watched from the railing with a knot of worry in his stomach that had nothing to do with doubting Sasuke's skill and everything to do with the temporary seal Kakashi had applied to keep the curse mark contained. 2 days had passed since the forest, and Sasuke still moved with a faint stiffness in his shoulders that suggested the mark's presence had not entirely receded, merely gone quiet. The match started evenly enough, Sasuke's speed and precision matching Yoroi's grappling attempts blow for blow, but as the fight wore on, Naruto noticed something that made the knot in his stomach tighten further. Sasuke was slowing, almost imperceptibly, his usually flawless form developing small hesitations that had nothing to do with Yoroi's technique and everything to do with something happening beneath the bandage still wrapped around his neck. Something's wrong, Naruto muttered. Beside him, Sakura's knuckles had gone white against the railing. The mark. It has to be the mark. Yoroi seemed to sense the shift as well, pressing his advantage with renewed aggression, closing distance for another attempt at direct contact, and it was in the moment his palm made contact with Sasuke's forearm, chakra beginning to visibly drain, that something changed. Dark marks spread outward from beneath the bandage at Sasuke's neck, faster and darker than they had in the forest, crawling across pale skin like something alive and hungry, and Sasuke's eyes, when he looked up, had gone from their usual dark to something wrong, something with too much yellow bleeding into the edges. The power that followed was immediate and undeniable. Sasuke's next strike came faster than anything he had thrown in the match so far, faster than anything Naruto had ever seen him throw, catching Yoroi across the jaw with enough force to send him skidding several feet across the arena floor. What followed was less a display of technique and more a display of raw, hungry aggression, strike after strike delivered with a speed and viciousness that had nothing of Sasuke's usual controlled precision in it at all. "Sasuke, stop!" Naruto shouted, though he knew even as he said it that his voice would not reach the arena floor, would not cut through whatever was currently driving his teammates' movements. Kakashi moved before anyone else could, dropping from the observation deck directly onto the arena floor in a blur that startled even the proctor, closing the distance to Sasuke in seconds and pressing 2 fingers hard against the mark itself, a burst of concentrated chakra flaring between his hand and Sasuke's skin. The dark marks receded almost instantly, retreating back beneath the bandage with visible reluctance, and Sasuke staggered, blinking rapidly as awareness returned to eyes that had, moments before, belonged to someone else entirely. Yoroi, badly bruised but conscious, was helped from the arena floor by medical staff as the proctor called the match in Sasuke's favor, though the victory felt, to everyone watching, considerably less triumphant than it should have. "That mark is more dangerous than we initially assessed," Kakashi said quietly to Sasuke, helping him toward the exit, voice pitched low enough that only those nearby could hear it. "We're going to need a proper containment seal, not just a temporary suppression. I know someone who can do it properly." Sasuke did not answer immediately, staring down at his own hands with an expression that mixed fear and something darker, something that looked uncomfortably like fascination with the power he had just felt surge through him. "It felt," he said finally, quiet enough that Naruto, arriving at the bottom of the stairs just in time to catch it, felt a chill run down his spine at the words, like finally being strong enough. "Like everything I've been working toward, just hand it to me." "That's exactly why it's dangerous," Kakashi said, sharper than his usual measured tone. "Power that isn't earned costs something eventually, Sasuke." "It always does." Naruto stepped up beside his teammate, saying nothing for a long moment, just standing there in a show of solidarity he was not entirely sure Sasuke wanted but offered anyway. You don't need it, Naruto said finally. Whatever that mark is offering you. You're strong without it. I've seen it. Sasuke looked at him for a long moment, something complicated moving behind dark eyes that had, minutes ago, belonged to someone else entirely, and did not answer, though something in his posture eased fractionally, just enough to suggest the words had landed somewhere that mattered. Chapter 8. The preliminaries concluded by early evening, the field of genin narrowed down to a final 8 who would advance to the tournament proper, 1 month from now, giving each competitor time to prepare in whatever fashion their sensei deemed necessary. Naruto's name appeared among the 8, alongside Sasuke's, and the bracket that would determine the final matches drew a considerable amount of murmured commentary from the observation deck when it resolved on the display screen. Naruto had been paired against a Tsunade genin named Gaara, whose 2 matches so far had ended with an efficiency and lack of visible effort that had unsettled more than a few of the watching jonin. Sasuke had drawn a Kirigakure competitor Naruto did not know well. Gaara, Kakashi said, studying the bracket with an expression that had gone carefully neutral in the specific way Naruto had learned meant his sensei was more concerned than he was letting on. I don't know much about him personally. But Tsunade's sensei has been notably reluctant to discuss his abilities in any detail, which tells me quite a lot on its own. I can handle it, Naruto said, with more confidence than he entirely felt, though the 2 weeks leading up to the exam had taught him at least this much. That confidence built on actual preparation felt considerably more solid than confidence built on nothing at all. Tsunade found him that evening at the small apartment she had rented near the tower for the duration of the exam, arms crossed in the doorway with an expression that mixed genuine pride and the particular sternness of a teacher who had no intention of letting a single good performance go to anyone's head. You fought well today, she said. Better than well. That chain work in the second half of your match was exactly the kind of controlled deployment I've been drilling into you. Thanks, Granny Tsunade. Don't let it go to your head. She stepped inside and settled onto a low stool, studying him with the frank assessment he had grown used to over the past month. 1 month is not a lot of time, but it's more than we had before the exam started. I want to use it properly. Your chain control is solid for someone your age and experience level, but it's still built for defense and short bursts. Against an opponent like the one you've drawn, defense alone won't be enough. What do you mean? I mean I watched that boy's first 2 matches, and I did not like what I saw. Tsunade's voice had gone into the clinical register that meant she was choosing her words with unusual care. He fights like someone who has never once been afraid of getting hurt, which either means he's remarkably confident, or it means something about him makes injury largely irrelevant. I don't know which yet. I intend to find out before your match, and I intend for you to be ready regardless of which answer turns out to be true. Naruto absorbed that with the seriousness it deserved, some of the easy confidence from earlier settling into something steadier, more grounded. So what are we working on? Combining the chains with your clones properly, for a start. Right now you use them as separate tools. I want you using them together, chains reinforcing your clones' positioning, clones creating openings your chains can exploit. And we're going to keep building your reserves, because whatever that boy is carrying, I suspect you're going to need every scrap of stamina you can manage. Sounds exhausting. It will be. Something almost fond crept into her stern expression despite her best efforts to suppress it. But you've never once complained about exhausting work when it actually mattered, Naruto. I don't expect that to start now. He grinned at her, some of his usual brightness returning despite the weight of the month ahead. No complaints. Just tell me where to start. Tomorrow morning. Early. She stood, heading for the door, then paused, looking back at him with an expression that had gone briefly, uncharacteristically soft. You did good today. I wanted you to hear that clearly, not just buried under all the corrections. You've come further in a month than most shinobi manage in years. I had a good teacher, Naruto said. Tsunade did not answer that directly, only shook her head slightly, something suspiciously close to emotion crossing her face before she turned and left, and Naruto sat alone in the small apartment for a while afterward, turning her words over in his mind, feeling, for the first time in longer than he could remember, genuinely, solidly prepared for whatever came next. Chapter 9. The message reached Danzo 3 days into the training month, delivered by a root operative who knelt in his office with the same flat, practiced stillness all of his subordinates were trained to maintain regardless of the news they carried. The Uzumaki boys' training has continued under Lady Tsunade's direct supervision, uninterrupted, the operative reported. Chain deployment observed in combination with shadow clone techniques during 2 separate training sessions. Control has improved measurably since the preliminary matches. Confirmed sighting of Orochimaru's known associate Kabuto Yakushi observing the boys' match, consistent with intelligence suggesting continued sound interest. Danzo absorbed the report without visible reaction, turning it over in his mind with the patience of a man for whom a month represented, in the scope of decades of careful planning, barely any time at all, and the Hokage's position on root involvement, unchanged, as of the last council session. Formal oversight remains denied. I expected as much. Danzo's cane tapped once against the floor, a habitual gesture that in another man might have signaled irritation, in him signaled only the beginning of calculation. Hiruzen's sentimentality has always been his greatest weakness. He sees a child where I see a village's future security, and he will continue seeing only that until circumstance forces his hand. He dismissed the operative and sat alone for a long while, weighing options that had been narrowing steadily over the past month. Direct confrontation with Hiruzen had failed. A formal council proposal, floated carefully through allies on the civilian side, had stalled without gaining sufficient traction to force a vote. What remained was the kind of quieter, more patient approach that had built root into what it was over the course of decades, small moves accumulated carefully over time until the shape of the whole became difficult for anyone to fully see, let alone stop. He summoned a different operative that evening, one whose face rarely appeared in any official root roster, and gave instructions delivered in the flat, economical language that left no room for interpretation beyond exactly what was said. I want a controlled test of the boy's ability. Nothing that would trace back to this office. An engineered scenario, sufficient pressure to force a genuine display of the chains under duress, observed and recorded from a safe distance. I want to understand precisely what he is capable of before the finals, independent of whatever assessment Tsunade chooses to share or withhold. Understood. Method of engagement? Subtle. A staged confrontation during one of his solo training sessions, using assets that will not be traced back to root regardless of outcome. He is not to be seriously harmed. I want data, not casualties. The operative bowed and departed, and Danzo remained alone in his bare office a while longer, turning the plan over with the same patient scrutiny he applied to every piece of the larger architecture he had spent decades quietly building. He did not particularly enjoy operating around the Hokage's explicit wishes. He had done it before, when necessity demanded it, and he expected he would do it again, secure in the conviction, unshaken across 40 years of service, that his own judgment regarding the village's security served that security more faithfully than sentiment ever could. 3 days later, during one of Naruto's rare solo training sessions away from Tsunade's direct supervision, a group of disguised mercenaries, their affiliation deliberately obscured, staged an ambush at the edge of a secluded training ground, striking with enough coordinated aggression to genuinely threaten a lone genin working through drills alone. Naruto's response came fast and instinctive, chains lashing out in coordinated bursts alongside a wave of shadow clones that flooded the clearing with confusing, overlapping targets, exactly the combined technique Tsunade had spent the past 3 days drilling into him. The mercenaries, whoever they actually were, retreated within minutes, having gathered, unbeknownst to Naruto, precisely the kind of combat data their true employer had requested. What none of them accounted for was Tsunade's own instincts, honed across decades of paranoia earned the hard way, which had led her to shadow Naruto's solo sessions from a discreet distance more often than she ever admitted to him directly. She arrived at the clearing minutes after the mercenaries fled, found Naruto shaken but unharmed, and stood for a long moment afterward studying the tracks left behind with an expression that had gone cold, and calculating in a way Naruto had not seen from her before. "Someone's testing you," she said quietly, more to herself than to him. "And I have a fairly good idea who." Naruto followed her gaze toward the tree line where the attackers had vanished, still catching his breath, adrenaline slowly draining out of him and leaving behind the particular hollow unease of realizing a fight had been something other than what it appeared to be. You think it was staged? On purpose? I think real mercenaries after an easy target don't retreat the moment things stop going their way, Tsunade said. Not without at least trying to salvage something from the engagement first. That felt like people who got exactly what they came for and left the instant they had it. She crouched to examine a set of tracks pressed into the soft earth near the clearing's edge, expression hardening further as she traced their pattern. Controlled retreat. Deliberate formation. That's not the discipline of hired thugs. That's the discipline of people trained to gather information and disappear cleanly. Rude, Naruto said, the word settling in his chest like a stone. Possibly. Tsunade straightened, brushing dirt from her hands with more force than the task strictly required. I'm not going to accuse anyone without proof. But I intend to get proof, and soon, because I will not have you used as a test subject for someone else's paranoid contingency planning. Chapter 10. Tsunade did not bother scheduling a formal audience. She went straight to Danzo's office the following morning, brushing past a pair of startled root guards at the entrance with a level of casual disregard for their presence that suggested she did not consider them a meaningful obstacle, and found the man himself seated behind his desk with an expression that betrayed no surprise whatsoever at her arrival. Lady Tsunade, Danzo said, setting down whatever report he had been reading with unhurried precision. I confess I expected this visit sooner. Cut the pleasantries. Tsunade planted both hands on his desk and leaned forward, voice low and dangerous in a way that had made lesser men flinch across 4 decades of her career. Someone staged an ambush against my student yesterday. Disguised mercenaries, coordinated enough to look real, careful enough not to actually kill him. I want to know if that was you. That's a serious accusation to level without evidence. I don't need evidence, Danzo. I need you to understand that if it happens again, evidence is going to become considerably less relevant to how I handle it. Something old and dangerous had entered her voice, the particular steel of a Sannin who had, in her younger years, been feared across the elemental nations for reasons that had nothing to do with medicine. I buried a brother and the man I loved because this village asked too much of people too young to understand what they were sacrificing. I did not come back here to watch it happen again to a boy who has already survived more than his fair share of that same pattern. Danzo studied her for a long moment, his single visible eye giving away nothing. You assume malice where there may only be prudent caution. A Jinchuriki with an emerging bloodline capability, targeted by a rogue Sannin who has already made his interest explicit, represents a security concern this village cannot afford to leave unassessed. There are assessment methods that don't involve staging fake attacks against a 12-year-old to gather combat data. Tsunade's voice had dropped lower, colder. If you want to know what he's capable of, ask me. I'll tell you exactly as much as is relevant to this village's security, and not one detail more. What you do not get to do is run unauthorized operations against the genin under my direct supervision because the Hokage's official answer wasn't the one you wanted. Silence stretched between them, taut and unresolved, until the office door opened without a knock and Hiruzen himself stepped inside, flanked by 2 ANBU who took up position near the entrance with the particular readiness of guards anticipating trouble. I received a report this morning, Hiruzen said, voice carrying a controlled fury that Tsunade had rarely heard from him even in their younger years together, of an unregistered engagement near the eastern training grounds yesterday, involving disguised combatants and one of our genin. I would like an explanation, Danzo, and I would like it to be considerably more honest than whatever you were preparing to offer Lady Tsunade. Danzo's expression did not change, though something in his posture shifted fractionally, the careful recalibration of a man recognizing that a line had been crossed more visibly than he had intended. A precautionary assessment, Danzo said. Nothing more. The boy was never in genuine danger. That is not your determination to make, Hiruzen said. I explicitly denied root involvement with that boy 3 weeks ago, and I explicitly deny it again now, in terms I intend to make considerably harder for you to circumvent going forward. Any further unauthorized engagement, staged or otherwise, targeting Naruto Uzumaki or interfering with his training under Lady Tsunade, will be treated as an act of insubordination against direct Hokage orders, with all the consequences that carries. Am I understood? The two old rivals held each other's gaze for a long moment. Decades of careful, wary coexistence balanced on a knife's edge that both of them understood, without needing to say so aloud, had just shifted meaningfully. Understood, Danzo said finally, the word carrying no genuine concession behind it, only the flat acknowledgement of a tactical retreat rather than a surrendered position. Hiruzen did not appear satisfied by the answer, but he let it stand, and Tsunade left the office a few minutes later with Hiruzen beside her, both of them silent until they were well clear of Root's section of the building entirely. He'll try something else, Tsunade said quietly. Men like him don't stop. They just get more careful about how it looks afterward. I know, Hiruzen said, weariness settling visibly into his shoulders. I've known that about him for longer than I care to admit. I intend to keep watching regardless. And I would appreciate it, Tsunade, if you would consider staying in this village a while longer than you originally planned. I think that boy is going to need every advocate he can get, for considerably longer than one Chunin exam. Tsunade did not answer immediately, thinking of a boy with an unfinished bloodline and an unstoppable amount of stubborn heart, currently somewhere across the village grinding through another day of exhausting, unglamorous training with the same relentless focus he brought to everything that actually mattered to him. I wasn't planning on leaving any time soon, she said finally. Not after all this. Chapter 11. Sasuke found Naruto at the training ground a week before the finals, sitting alone in the grass during a rare break between drills, staring up at a sky streaked with the last orange light of evening. You've gotten stronger, Sasuke said, settling down a short distance away without being invited, which for him counted as a significant gesture of familiarity. So have you, Naruto said. That mark hasn't been bothering you as much lately. Kakashi found someone to apply a proper containment seal. It helps. Sasuke was quiet for a moment, picking at a blade of grass with more focus than the action required. I've been thinking about what you said. After the prelims. About not needing it. And, you were right. The admission came out stiff, uncomfortable, the particular difficulty of someone unused to conceding points in conversation. It felt like power without cost, in the moment. But Kakashi's right too. Power like that always ends up costing something, even when it doesn't feel like it at the time. I don't want to owe anything to whatever gave me this mark. Naruto studied his teammate for a long moment, surprised by the openness of it, the willingness to say something vulnerable out loud rather than burying it under the usual careful reserve. For what it's worth, I think you're strong enough without it. I've always thought that. I know you have. Something almost like a smile crossed Sasuke's face, brief and unfamiliar but genuine. It's part of why I've started listening when you say things like that. You don't usually say what you don't mean. They sat together in comfortable silence for a while after that, watching the sky darken toward evening, two teammates who had spent years circling each other with more rivalry than genuine friendship finally settling, however imperfectly, into something that felt considerably more solid. Across the village, in a small rented room that smelled faintly of antiseptic and old paper, Kabuto Yakushi finished the last details of a report he had been compiling for the better part of a week, sealing it carefully before summoning the small snake that would carry word back to wherever Orochimaru currently kept himself hidden in the aftermath of the forest. The chain bloodline has developed considerably faster than anticipated, he murmured, reviewing his notes one final time. Combined shadow clone and chain technique observed during the preliminary matches, control markedly improved since. Tsunade's personal involvement appears to be the primary catalyst. The Uchiha's curse mark progression remains stable under Konoha's containment efforts, slower than optimal but within acceptable parameters for eventual activation. He set the report aside and adjusted his glasses, thinking of the strange, golden thread of chakra he had watched wrap around an opponent's wrist during the preliminary matches, the particular controlled precision of it that suggested, whatever else was true about the boy's future, his development represented something genuinely rare in the shinobi world. Lord Orochimaru would be pleased with the detail, if not entirely pleased with the timeline. Whatever plans were currently being finalized for the exam's conclusion, Kabuto suspected, based on nothing more than years of careful study of his employer's particular fascinations, that the chain boy's presence in the finals had just become considerably more interesting than a simple bracket placement would suggest. He dispatched the report and settled back to wait, turning his attention to the considerably larger preparations still underway for what was coming, preparations that had nothing to do with a single genin's bloodline and everything to do with an invasion that would, within a matter of weeks, bring far greater consequences down on Konoha than one curious Sanin's passing interest in a chain-wielding Jinchuriki. Chapter 12. The night before the finals, Konoha settled into the particular hush that always preceded a major event, streets quieter than usual, banners already strung along the route toward the arena in preparation for a crowd that would include dignitaries from every allied village, and unofficially, considerably more scrutiny of one specific genin than most tournament finals typically attracted. Naruto stood on the roof of his apartment building, looking out over the darkened village, feeling a mixture of nerves and readiness that felt entirely unfamiliar compared to the pure anxious dread he might have felt facing this same match a month earlier. Tsunade found him there, climbing up without announcement in a way that had stopped surprising him weeks ago. "Nervous?" she asked, settling beside him with the easy familiarity of someone who no longer needed invitation to share a comfortable silence. "A little," Naruto admitted. "That Tsunade Gara. Something about him feels wrong in a way I can't quite explain. Not evil exactly. Just, I don't know. Alone. Like he's carrying something nobody's ever helped him with." Tsunade considered that for a long moment, filing it away with the same careful attention she gave every piece of information about her student's growing instincts. "You might be right about that. I did some digging, quietly, over the last few weeks. Suna hasn't confirmed anything officially, but there are patterns in what little information exists about that boy that remind me of things I'd rather not have confirmed." "What kind of patterns?" "The kind that suggest you two might have more in common than either of you realizes." She did not elaborate further, and Naruto had learned by now not to push when her voice took on that particular careful weight. "Whatever happens in that match tomorrow, remember what I've spent the last month teaching you. Control before power. Observation before commitment. You don't have to win by overwhelming him. You just have to be smarter about how you use what you've got." "I've got a good teacher," Naruto said, echoing words he had said to her weeks earlier, and this time Tsunade let herself smile without hiding it, something warm and unguarded that had become steadily more common over the past month. "Get some sleep," she said, standing to leave. "Tomorrow's going to be a long day, one way or another." She left him alone on the rooftop, and Naruto stayed a while longer, looking out over the village that had spent so many years treating him as an afterthought, feeling, for the first time, genuinely ready to prove that assessment wrong. Elsewhere in the village, in offices and hidden chambers scattered across Konoha's careful architecture of secrets, other pieces were already moving into position for what tomorrow would bring. Danzo reviewed final contingencies with the patient calculation of a man who had learned, over the past month, that direct confrontation with Hiruzen carried costs he was not yet prepared to pay openly, but who had by no means abandoned his broader ambitions regarding the boy's future usefulness. Somewhere beyond the village walls, in a hidden staging area that no official Konoha patrol had yet discovered, disguised sound and sand forces made final preparations for an assault timed to strike at the precise moment the finals reached their most vulnerable point, an invasion built around exploiting exactly the kind of packed, undefended crowd that a Chunin exam finale would inevitably create. And in a small, undecorated room somewhere within the village, Kabuto Yakushi finished his final preparations for the following day, reviewing notes on Naruto's chain technique one last time with the particular satisfaction of a man anticipating that tomorrow's events would provide considerably more useful data than a simple tournament match ever could. None of it had happened yet. For now there was only a quiet village settling into an uneasy, expectant sleep, a boy on a rooftop feeling more ready than he had ever felt for anything in his life, and the first gray edges of dawn already beginning to gather somewhere over the eastern horizon, carrying with it a day that would test everything Naruto had built over the past month in ways none of them, not even Tsunade, could fully anticipate. Act 3 Chapter 1. The arena had never looked so full. Tiered stone seating rose on all sides of the open tournament ground, packed shoulder to shoulder with villagers, visiting dignitaries, and shinobi from every allied nation, banners from Suna and Kiri and Kumo hanging alongside Konoha's own leaf symbol in a rare display of formal unity between villages that spent most years regarding each other with careful, professional suspicion. Naruto stood in the competitors' waiting area beneath the stands, listening to the muffled roar of the crowd above and trying to ignore the way his stomach kept twisting itself into increasingly elaborate knots. "You'll be fine," Sakura said, appearing at his shoulder with a confidence that sounded only partially manufactured for his benefit. "You've trained harder for this than anyone. Tsunade wouldn't have let you walk in here if she didn't think you were ready." "I know." He managed a grin that felt more solid than it had an hour ago. "Doesn't stop the nerves, though." Across the waiting room, Sasuke sat alone on a low bench, testing the range of motion in his shoulder with the careful, methodical attention of someone who had spent the last month learning not to trust his own body completely. The containment seal at his neck, hidden beneath a fresh wrap of bandages, had held steady through the entire training period, though Kakashi still watched him with the particular vigilance of a man who understood exactly how thin that stability actually was. Kakashi himself arrived a few minutes later, having finished whatever final consultation he'd been having with the tournament officials, and gathered both his genin with a look that carried more weight than his usual lazy demeanor suggested. "Whatever happens out there today," he said, "remember that you've already accomplished something most genin your age never do. You survived the forest. You survived the preliminaries. Today is just one more test, not a verdict on everything you are." "That's oddly serious for you," Naruto said. "I have my moments." Kakashi's visible eye crinkled in the shape of a smile that didn't quite reach the rest of his carefully neutral expression, and something in the set of his shoulders suggested he was watching the crowd above with more wariness than the occasion strictly called for. Above them, in the elevated Kage box overlooking the arena floor, Hiruzen Sarutobi took his seat beside the visiting Kazekage of Suna, exchanging the careful, formal pleasantries expected between two leaders whose villages maintained peace through mutual convenience rather than genuine warmth. The Kazekage, wrapped in ceremonial robes and a wide-brimmed hat that obscured most of his face, offered the expected courtesies with a stiffness that Hiruzen noted but attributed, not unreasonably, to the general discomfort of formal occasions. Tsunade found a seat in the stands rather than the official box, close enough to the arena floor to watch clearly, distant enough to avoid drawing the kind of attention her presence would inevitably generate among the assembled dignitaries. Shizen sat beside her, scanning the crowd with the quiet professional wariness both of them had carried since the incident with Danzo's staged ambush weeks earlier. "Nervous?" Shizen asked. "For him?" "A little." Tsunade's eyes tracked toward the competitor's entrance, waiting for the moment Naruto would emerge onto the arena floor. "For everything else happening around this exam that has nothing to do with the actual matches." "Considerably more than a little. You think something's going to happen." "I think a rogue Sannin who's already expressed personal interest in that boy, combined with an invasion force I still can't prove exists, but every instinct I've built over 40 years insists is coming, adds up to considerably more risk than a simple tournament final." Tsunade's jaw tightened, gaze sweeping the crowd with the particular thoroughness of someone cataloging exits and vulnerabilities rather than simply enjoying a show. "I've asked Hiruzen twice to consider postponing. He won't. Says canceling would signal weakness to every village watching." "Is he wrong?" "No," Tsunade admitted, reluctantly. "That's what makes it so difficult to argue with." Below, the tournament announcer's voice rang out across the packed arena, calling the crowd to order, and the first two names for the day's opening match echoed across the stone amphitheater. Naruto stepped out onto the arena floor a few minutes later, blinking against the sudden brightness of open sky after the shadowed waiting room, and found himself looking across the packed stone circle at a pale, red-haired boy with dark rings around unblinking eyes, standing perfectly, unnervingly still, waiting for their match to begin. Chapter 2. Uzumaki Naruto vs. Sabaka no Gaara, the proctor announced, stepping back to the arena's edge. "Begin." Gaara did not move. He stood exactly where he had been standing, arms loosely crossed, sand shifting restlessly in the gourd strapped to his back, watching Naruto with an expression that held none of the usual pre-match tension Naruto had come to expect from opponents. There was something almost bored in it, or would have been, if not for the raw, watchful hunger underneath that Naruto's chain instincts flagged immediately as something considerably more dangerous than simple confidence. You're not going to attack first, Gaara said. It wasn't a question. Interesting. I like to see what I'm dealing with before I commit to anything, Naruto said, circling carefully, chakra sense spread wide the way Tsunade had spent a month drilling into him. Seems smarter than just charging in. Around them, the packed stands had gone unusually quiet, sensing, even without understanding why, that something more careful and more deliberate was unfolding than the opening exchange of a typical genin match. Smart won't save you. Something flickered across Gaara's face, brief and unreadable. Nothing has ever saved anyone from me. Mother sees to that. The sand moved before Naruto fully processed the threat, a wave of it surging forward with a speed that belied its bulk, and he threw himself sideways on instinct, feeling the displaced air of its passage close enough to raise the hair on his arms. He came up already forming the seal for shadow clones, a dozen copies flooding the arena floor in staggered bursts, exactly the combined technique he and Tsunade had spent the past month refining. Gaara's sand responded with mechanical, almost lazy efficiency, sweeping through the clones in wide arcs that dissolved them faster than Naruto could reposition, and within seconds he understood, with a cold certainty that settled low in his stomach, that raw numbers were not going to be enough against a defense this absolute. He tried the chains next, 3 threads lashing out from different angles simultaneously, testing for any gap in the sand's coverage, and found each one intercepted with the same effortless precision, sand hardening on contact into something that deflected the chains without so much as slowing. Is that everything? Gaara asked, and there was no real mockery in it, only a strange, flat curiosity, the tone of someone genuinely uncertain whether disappointment was the correct response. Naruto pulled back, breathing hard, cataloging what he just learned the way Tsunade had taught him to catalog a difficult chakra pattern rather than simply reacting to failure with more force. The sand moved on its own, faster than conscious direction should allow, which meant it was likely operating on some kind of automatic defense rather than Gaara's deliberate will alone. That meant patterns. Patterns meant openings, eventually, if he was patient enough to find them. Not even close, he said, and grinned, more confidence in it than he currently felt but enough conviction behind the words to make them mean something anyway. He came in again, this time combining clones and chains in the layered formation Tsunade had spent their final week drilling into muscle memory, clones creating deliberate openings for the chains to exploit rather than attacking independently, forcing the automatic sand defense to divide its attention across multiple simultaneous threats instead of responding to each one in isolation. It worked marginally. One chain slipped past the sand's immediate response, close enough to graze Gaara's shoulder before the defense caught up and yanked it away, and for one brief, startled moment something like genuine surprise crossed the boy's face, quickly buried beneath the same flat watchfulness as before. You drew blood, Gaara said, touching 2 fingers to the thin cut on his shoulder and studying the resulting smear of red with an expression that had shifted, subtly, into something closer to fascination than anger. No one has done that in a very long time. The sand around him surged with sudden, visible aggression, and Naruto understood, watching it rise into a defensive wall that pulsed with barely contained hunger, that whatever fragile opening he had just found had come at the cost of provoking something considerably more dangerous than the careful, testing exchange they had traded so far. In the stands above, Tsunade leaned forward, gripping the railing hard enough that her knuckles had gone white, watching a month of careful, patient teaching collide against something that even her considerable experience recognized, with growing unease, as far more unstable and far more desperate than a typical tournament opponent had any right to be. Chapter 3. The sand came at him like something alive and starving, and Naruto understood, in the fraction of a second before it closed around him, that whatever restraint Gaara had been exercising through the earlier exchanges had just ended entirely. He barely got clear, chains lashing out to yank himself sideways in a desperate, ungraceful save that left him skidding hard against the arena floor, breath knocked loose, watching the spot he'd occupied a heartbeat earlier collapse under a crushing weight of compressed sand that would have shattered bone if it had connected. Why do you keep dodging? Gaara said, voice carrying an edge of genuine confusion beneath the growing hunger. Fighting is supposed to prove existence. Why not simply let it happen? Because I don't want to die, And I definitely don't want to hurt you if I don't have to, Naruto shot back, scrambling upright, chest heaving. That's not confusing. That's just not wanting either of us to end up broken over a tournament match. Either of us. Something in Gaara's flat expression cracked, just slightly, an unfamiliar concept visibly working its way through a mind that did not seem accustomed to considering it. No one has ever worried about whether I end up broken. Mother doesn't care. Father sent assassins instead of comfort. My own siblings flinch when I walk past them. Naruto felt something in his chest twist painfully at that, recognition arriving with the force of a physical blow, the particular ache of hearing his own loneliest years reflected back at him from someone standing on the opposite side of an arena trying to kill him. I know what that's like, he said, quieter now, the words coming out before he fully decided to say them. Not exactly the same. But close enough that I recognize it. Growing up with everyone looking at you like you're a monster before you've even done anything to earn it. Having something inside you that everyone's more afraid of than they are of actually getting to know you. Gaara went very still, sand pausing mid-motion around him, the same flat hunger in his expression flickering, for just a moment, into something closer to raw, uncertain confusion. You're a Jinchuriki too, he said. It wasn't a question either, not really, more a realization arriving out loud. Yeah. Naruto held his ground, chains dissolving from his forearms, a deliberate choice to stand undefended in front of someone who had just tried to crush him, a risk that felt, somehow, more important than any tactical advantage he might have gained by staying guarded. Kurama, the Nine Tails. Spent most of my life with people crossing the street to avoid me, parents telling their kids to stay away. And I never understood why until I was old enough to figure out what everyone else already knew and wouldn't tell me. And you don't hate it, Gaara said, disbelief threading through the words. The thing inside you. You don't want it gone. I used to. Naruto thought of Tsunade's steady patience over the last month, of a month spent learning that the thing he carried didn't have to define him unless he let it, of chains that had once terrified him now sitting steady and controlled beneath his skin. Now I think it's just part of what I am. Doesn't make me a monster unless I decide to act like one. That part's still up to me. The sand around Gaara had stopped moving entirely now, hanging suspended in the air with none of its earlier hungry momentum, and something in the boy's face had shifted into an expression Naruto didn't have a name for, raw and unguarded and younger than anything he'd shown since the match began. No one has ever talked to me like this, Gaara said, voice smaller now, stripped of its earlier flat menace. Like existing wasn't something I had to prove through killing. Maybe that's the problem, Naruto said gently. Maybe nobody ever gave you a reason to think there was another option. The sand collapsed around Gaara's feet in a slow, uncertain settling, no longer defensive, no longer hungry, just quiet grains sliding harmlessly across the arena floor, and for a long moment the two boys simply stood there, several yards apart, looking at each other across a silence that felt considerably more significant than any exchange of blows could have been. The proctor, uncertain how to read a match that had effectively stopped without a clear victor, hesitated for several long seconds before finally raising a hand toward Naruto's side of the arena. Winner, he called, though his voice carried more confusion than confidence, Uzumaki Naruto. The crowd's reaction came delayed and scattered, uncertain applause rippling through stands that had watched something they didn't entirely understand, and high above in the Kage box, the false Kazekage beneath his wide-brimmed hat watched the outcome with a stillness that had nothing to do with confusion at all, only cold, careful calculation, as a hand slid slowly, unnoticed, toward a hidden signal meant to launch considerably more than a simple tournament final into chaos. Chapter 4. The signal came as a flare of purple smoke rising from somewhere in the stands, subtle enough that most of the crowd registered it only as an oddity, and by the time anyone understood what it meant the arena had already begun to change around them. A heavy, suffocating genjutsu rolled outward from the Kage box in a visible wave, distorting the sky overhead into something dark and wrong, and Naruto, still standing on the arena floor processing the strange unresolved end of his match, felt the pressure of it hit like a physical wall. Genjutsu, Sasuke's voice cut through from somewhere nearby, sharp and immediate. Everyone stay alert. Above them, in the Kage box, the false Kazakage's wide-brimmed hat and ceremonial robes dissolved away in a ripple of shed skin, revealing pale features and slitted yellow eyes that Naruto recognized instantly, the memory of a cave mouth and Sasuke's scream still sharp enough to feel like it had happened yesterday rather than a month ago. Orochimaru, Naruto breathed. The Sannin moved with terrifying speed, closing on Hiruzen before the old Hokage could fully react to the Genjutsu's disorienting pull, and a barrier of shifting purple chakra snapped up around both of them, sealing the elevated box off from the arena floor entirely, a translucent dome that muffled sound and blocked any attempt at direct intervention. Chaos erupted through the stands simultaneously, disguised sound and sand shinobi dropping their transformation techniques and revealing themselves among the panicked crowd, launching coordinated attacks against startled Konoha shinobi caught flat-footed by an assault that had been staged with meticulous, patient care over the course of the entire tournament. "We need to get to the Hokage," Naruto shouted, already moving toward the barrier dome, chains flaring instinctively along both forearms. "You can't," Kakashi's voice cut across the chaos, appearing beside him in a blur, one hand closing hard on Naruto's shoulder. "That barrier is sealed from the inside. Anyone who touches it without the proper counter technique gets thrown back hard enough to break bones. Lord Third can handle himself. Right now our job is protecting the civilians caught in this crossfire." Naruto's chest burned with frustrated helplessness, watching the shifting purple dome that separated him from a fight he desperately wanted to help with. But Kakashi's words carried enough truth to cut through the panic, and he turned instead toward the nearest cluster of terrified villagers scrambling for the exits, chains lashing out to clear debris and redirect the crowd towards safer ground. Sasuke fought a short distance away, expression tight with concentration as he engaged a sound shinobi who had targeted a group of children trapped against the collapsed section of stands, movements sharp and precise despite the visible strain around his eyes that Naruto recognized, with a spike of fresh worry, as the curse mark stirring under the stress of open combat. Sakura moved with a focus that surprised even her teammates, coordinating with a cluster of Chunin to establish a defensible perimeter around the more vulnerable civilians, her precision and clear-headed strategy standing out sharply against the general chaos surrounding her. In the stands, Tsunade was already moving, cutting through the panicked crowd with brutal efficiency, one punch shattering a sound shinobi's guard entirely as she cleared a path toward the arena floor, Shizen close behind covering their flank with practiced precision. The barrier around the Kage box, Tsunade called to Kakashi as she reached the arena floor, voice tight with fury and calculation in equal measure. "Can it be broken from outside?" "Not with anything I've got," Kakashi said, deflecting a sand shinobi's kunai and countering hard enough to drop the man where he stood. "It's built to withstand exactly that kind of assault." Tsunade's gaze swept toward Naruto, still working to clear civilians from the collapsing stands, chains flaring with a controlled precision that had grown steadily more impressive over the past month, and something calculating settled behind her eyes as she watched the golden threads move with an unusual, almost structural quality that reminded her, suddenly and sharply, of exactly the kind of specialized Fuinjutsu-adjacent technique the barrier itself had likely been built to resist. "Maybe not with anything you've got," she murmured, already moving toward him through the chaos. "But possibly with something he's got." Chapter 5. Smoke rose in thick columns across the village skyline now, the invasion having spread beyond the arena itself into the streets and districts surrounding it. Sound and sand shinobi pressing an offensive that Konoha's defenders met with fierce, organized resistance despite the chaos of the initial ambush. Tsunade reached Naruto amid the arena's ongoing scramble, gripping his shoulder hard enough to pull his full attention away from the civilian he just guided clear of a collapsing support beam. "I need you to focus," she said, voice cutting through the surrounding noise with clinical urgency. "That barrier around Hiruzen is built from concentrated Fuinjutsu, meant to resist standard chakra assault and conventional ninjutsu both. But your chains aren't standard chakra. They're structural, closer to a physical construct than a typical technique. I think they might be able to find a seam in the seal array that a normal attack can't. You want me to try breaking him out. I want you to try, carefully, and I want you listening to every instruction I give you while you do it, because if this goes wrong the backlash could kill you before it even reaches the barrier itself." Tsunade's grip tightened briefly, something fierce and protective flashing across her expression before settling back into focused calculation. "Can you do that?" "Yeah." Naruto's voice carried none of its usual bravado, only steady, determined conviction. "Tell me what to do." Tsunade studied him for one brief, searching moment, some old caution warring visibly with the urgency of the situation. "Stay steady. Whatever you feel through that connection, whatever backlash builds up, you tell me immediately, and you stop the instant I say stop. This isn't the moment for stubbornness." "Steady," Naruto repeated, nodding, some of his usual restless energy settling into something calmer, more focused. The particular discipline 2 months of patient training had slowly built into him even under the worst kind of pressure. They moved together toward the shifting purple dome, Tsunade's trained eye tracing the visible seams of chakra that made up its structure with the same clinical precision she brought to diagnosing a difficult patient, calling out adjustments as Naruto extended a single careful thread of chain toward the barrier's surface, testing rather than forcing, searching for the weakness she'd identified. Elsewhere in the chaos, in a quieter administrative building several streets removed from the worst of the fighting, Danzo Shimura moved through emptied corridors with the calm, unhurried purpose of a man who had planned for exactly this kind of crisis long before it arrived. "With the Hokage isolated and the village under direct assault," he said, addressing a hastily assembled cluster of council elders who had gathered in the building's fortified meeting chamber, "emergency protocol dictates a temporary transfer of executive authority to ensure coordinated defense. I am proposing myself as acting authority for the duration of this crisis. That protocol requires a formal vote." "Danzo," one of the elders said, though uncertainty colored her voice, the general panic of the moment eroding some of the usual bureaucratic resistance that might otherwise have slowed him down. "We cannot simply hand over authority because the timing happens to be convenient. The timing is not convenient. It is catastrophic, which is precisely why decisive leadership matters more now than procedural caution." Danzo's voice carried the same flat, patient certainty it always did, the tone of a man who had rehearsed this exact argument for considerably longer than the current crisis had existed. "Every moment spent debating protocol is a moment our defenders operate without unified command." The vote, when it came, split closer than Danzo had likely anticipated, several elders holding firm against the pressure of the moment out of a wariness toward Root's methods that had only sharpened over the past month of increasingly visible friction with Hiruzen. It was not enough to grant Danzo the outright authority he sought, but it was enough to authorize a temporary joint command structure, Danzo included alongside 2 other senior jonin, a compromise that left him with considerably more influence over the village's immediate defense than he'd held an hour earlier, even if it fell short of the outright seizure he'd clearly been hoping the chaos might provide cover for. He accepted the compromise with outward grace, betraying nothing of the calculation still turning behind his single visible eye, already considering how this new, if limited, authority might be leveraged toward the broader goals he'd been quietly pursuing for considerably longer than this single crisis represented. Back at the arena, Naruto's chain finally found what it was searching for, a hairline seam in the barrier's structure that flexed minutely, under the careful, patient pressure of controlled golden chakra, and Tsunade's sharp intake of breath beside him carried the particular tension of someone watching a desperate gamble begin, finally, to show the first fragile signs of actually working. Chapter 6. A short distance from the barrier, Sasuke's fight against the second wave of sound shinobi had taken a turn that pulled Sakura's attention away from the civilian perimeter she'd been holding, sharp fear cutting through her focus, as she registered dark marks spreading rapidly across his neck and shoulder. "Sasuke," she called, already moving toward him, but the distance between them felt suddenly, terribly vast. The curse mark's advance came faster than it had during the preliminary matches, unleashed by the combined stress of open combat and the surrounding chaos, and Sasuke's movements shifted mid-fight into something faster and more brutal, his usual controlled precision replaced by a hungry, reckless aggression that dropped his current opponent in a single vicious exchange, but left him breathing hard. Eyes bleeding toward that same wrong shade of yellow Naruto remembered from the preliminaries. Kakashi was too far, engaged with his own opponents on the opposite side of the collapsing stands, and Sakura reached her teammate a moment too late to stop him from turning, marks still spreading, toward a group of sound shinobi with an expression that had nothing of Sasuke's usual restraint left in it at all. "Sasuke, stop, it's me," Sakura said, placing herself directly in his path despite the obvious danger, voice steady despite the fear plainly visible underneath. For a terrible, suspended moment, Sasuke's altered eyes fixed on her without any clear recognition at all, and Sakura held her ground anyway, refusing to flinch, refusing to give the mark the satisfaction of driving her back. Naruto arrived seconds later, having disengaged from the barrier work at Tsunade's urgent instruction the moment she'd sensed the mark's activation through some combination of medical instinct and simple proximity, closing the distance at a dead sprint. "Sasuke!" He grabbed his teammate's shoulder, and the moment his hand made contact, instinct took over in a way he hadn't consciously planned, a thin thread of controlled chain wrapping gently rather than violently around Sasuke's forearm, carrying with it the same careful, precise chakra controls Tsunade had spent weeks drilling into him through hours of chakra scalpel practice. It should not have worked. Naruto had never tried anything like it before, had no formal technique for using the chains this way, but something in the disciplined, controlled quality of the chakra he pushed through the connection seemed to cut through the mark's chaotic influence like a steady hand settling something that had been shaking uncontrollably. Sasuke's altered eyes flickered, the wrongness in them wavering, and Naruto pressed the moment, holding the contact steady despite the visible strain it cost him. "You don't need this," Naruto said, echoing words he'd said weeks earlier on a quiet training ground evening, urgent now in a way they hadn't been then. "You're stronger without it." "I know you are." "Fight it." For several long seconds nothing happened, Sasuke's breathing ragged, the dark marks holding their ground against whatever pressure Naruto's chain was exerting, and then, slowly, painfully, they began to recede, retreating back toward the containment seal at his neck with visible reluctance, like something being forced back into a cage it resented. Sasuke staggered as the mark's influence finally broke, catching himself against Naruto's shoulder, breathing hard, eyes returning gradually to their normal dark color. "What did you?" he managed, voice rough. "I don't know exactly," Naruto admitted, releasing the chain, his own chakra reserves noticeably depleted from the effort. "Just tried to give it something steady to push against instead of letting it run wild. Tsunade's been drilling control into me for weeks. Guess some of it was good for more than just my own chakra." Sakura reached them a moment later, relief and lingering fear warring across her face as she helped steady Sasuke's balance. "We need to get you somewhere safer. That's twice now the mark's activated under stress. We can't keep relying on Naruto happening to be close enough to interrupt it." "I know," Sasuke said, quiet and grim, some of his usual composure returning despite the visible exhaustion. "But right now, safer isn't really an option anyone's offering." "We'll figure something out," Sakura said, with more conviction than the current chaos strictly justified, though the determination in her voice seemed to steady all three of them slightly. "We always do." Sasuke managed something close to a wry, tired smile at that, an acknowledgement rather than genuine agreement, and the three of them regrouped for a moment amid the ongoing noise of battle, drawing whatever brief strength they could from simply standing together before scattering back into the fight. Around them, the sounds of ongoing battle continued unabated, and above the arena, the shifting purple dome ceiling horizon inside continued its slow, minute flex under the pressure of a chain thread Naruto had left anchored in the barrier's seam, patient and steady, waiting for the moment it would finally be enough. Chapter 7. Inside the sealed dome, Hiruzen Sarutobi faced a man who had once been his student with the particular grief of someone who had spent decades hoping, against steadily accumulating evidence, that redemption still remained somewhere within reach. "You didn't have to do any of this, Orochimaru," Hiruzen said, robes already discarded in favor of a combat stance that belied his advanced years. "There was still a place for you in this village, if you'd been willing to accept the boundaries that come with it." "Boundaries?" Orochimaru's laugh carried no warmth at all, only cold, bitter amusement. "You speak of boundaries as though limiting knowledge, limiting power, limiting what a person is permitted to become, was ever a reasonable price for belonging anywhere. I outgrew this village's boundaries decades ago, sensei. I simply chose, finally, to stop pretending otherwise." They fought with the speed and precision of two shinobi who had trained together across an entire lifetime, each move met with a countermove born from decades of shared history, and for several exchanges the outcome felt genuinely uncertain, Hiruzen's experience and controlled ferocity matching Orochimaru's raw, adaptable cunning blow for blow. The turning point came when Orochimaru summoned the reanimation technique, dark chakra swirling as two coffins rose from the ground within the sealed barrier, and Hiruzen felt something cold settle in his chest as familiar faces began to emerge from within, the first and second Hokages, resurrected and bound to Orochimaru's will. Their loyalty to the village twisted into a weapon against the very man who had once served beside them. "You would use them like this," Hiruzen said, horror and fury mixing in his voice as he recognized the faces of leaders he had personally known and respected. "I would use anything necessary," Orochimaru said, already retreating to a safer distance as his reanimated puppets advanced. "That has always been the difference between us, Sensei. You hesitate over what should be used. I simply use what works." Outside the barrier, unseen by either combatant, the thin golden thread Naruto had left anchored in the seal's hairline seam finally, gradually, found sufficient purchase, the structural nature of the chain working its way deeper into the barrier's Fuinjutsu architecture with each passing minute of steady, patient pressure. Within the dome, Hiruzen fought a desperate, grinding battle against two former mentors turned weapons, his own considerable skill and experience the only thing keeping him from being overwhelmed entirely, chakra reserves draining with alarming speed against opponents who did not tire, did not hesitate, and felt no pain that might otherwise have slowed their relentless assault. He was old, and he knew it with painful clarity in that moment, feeling decades of accumulated strain in muscles that no longer moved with quite the speed they once had, and for the first time in longer than he cared to admit, Hiruzen Sarutobi felt the genuine, cold possibility of his own death settling over the fight with each passing exchange. It was in that moment, chakra nearly spent, defending against the combined assault that had driven him to one knee, that the barrier around him finally, suddenly, tore open along the seam Naruto's chain had spent the better part of an hour patiently working loose, golden light flooding into the dome's shadowed interior alongside a familiar, furious voice. "Get away from him!" Tsunade came through the breach like something unstoppable, chakra gathered in both fists, and the strike she delivered to the nearer reanimated corpse shattered bone and sent the construct staggering backward with enough force to buy Hiruzen the precious seconds he desperately needed. About time, Hiruzen managed, breathless, relief and exhaustion warring plainly across his weathered face. "Don't thank me yet, old man," Tsunade said, already positioning herself between him and the advancing threats, chakra scalpel forming along one hand with lethal precision. "We're not finished here." Behind her, through the torn barrier, Naruto's voice carried clear and determined across the ruined arena floor. "Granny Tsunade! I'm coming too!" Chapter 8. Naruto scrambled through the torn barrier before anyone could tell him not to, chains already forming along both forearms, exhaustion from the earlier effort forgotten entirely in the face of watching Tsunade and Hiruzen fighting for their lives against two of the most legendary shinobi the village had ever produced, now twisted into something neither had ever agreed to become. "This is not a place for children," Orochimaru called out, though something in his voice carried more curiosity than genuine dismissal, watching Naruto's arrival with the same clinical fascination he'd shown weeks earlier in a darkened forest. "Yeah, well, I'm here anyway," Naruto shot back, already moving to intercept the reanimated second Hokage's advance towards Tsunade's exposed flank, chains lashing out in the layered, coordinated pattern he'd spent weeks refining against Gaara's sand defense. Orochimaru's yellow eyes tracked the movement with genuine, undisguised interest, filing away every detail of the technique's growing sophistication even as he redirected his reanimated puppets to press the advantage. The reanimated construct absorbed the chain's impact without any visible sign of pain or hesitation. Water techniques flowing with the same devastating precision the real second Hokage had been famous for in life, and Naruto found himself scrambling to stay ahead of an opponent whose skill vastly outmatched his own experience, buying seconds rather than winning exchanges outright. Tsunade fought with a ferocity that seemed to draw on decades of carefully banked frustration, chakra-enhanced strikes shattering bone and forcing the reanimated first Hokage back step by grinding step. Her medical precision turned to devastating effect as she targeted the specific structural weaknesses of a technique built from reconstructed, imperfect flesh rather than a living body's true resilience. The binding seals, she called out, breathless, catching Hiruzen's eye across the chaotic exchange. Reanimation techniques like this always have a control seal somewhere on the summoner. Break his concentration and the puppets lose their animation. Hiruzen nodded grimly, gathering the last reserves of his considerable chakra for one final, focused assault, and Naruto, hearing the exchange, understood immediately what needed to happen. I can distract him, Naruto called, already breaking away from his current exchange, chains extending toward Orochimaru's position with reckless, deliberate aggression. Buy you the opening. It was a desperate gamble, and everyone present understood the risk of it, but Naruto's chains, still developing but growing steadily more precise with every week of training, forced Orochimaru to actually engage directly rather than simply directing his reanimated puppets from a comfortable distance, precisely the kind of distraction Hiruzen needed. The old Hokage moved with a final, desperate burst of speed, closing the distance while Orochimaru's attention remained split, and the technique he unleashed, a concentrated blast of chakra aimed directly at the Sanin's exposed side, connected with enough force to send Orochimaru staggering backward, blood blooming dark across pale robes. The reanimated Hokages collapsed the instant Orochimaru's concentration broke, animation fading from their forms as the summoning technique lost its anchor, and for one suspended moment the sealed dome fell into ringing, exhausted silence. Orochimaru straightened slowly, pressing a hand against the wound at his side, expression twisting into something between fury and grudging, clinical respect as he studied the three figures now arrayed against him, an old man, a legendary medic, and a genin barely past childhood, all three still standing despite everything he'd thrown at them. Interesting, he said, voice tight with pain but carrying none of the panic a more ordinary opponent might have felt. Perhaps another time, then, when the circumstances favor me more comfortably. There won't be a good time for you here, Tsunade said, chakra scalpel still humming faintly along one hand, fury and exhaustion both plain in her voice. Not while any of us are still standing. Perhaps not, Orochimaru allowed, something almost amused threading through the pain in his voice despite the wound at his side. Then I shall simply have to ensure I remain patient a while longer. He retreated in a swirl of shed skin and shadow before anyone could close the distance, wounded but very much alive, and the barrier itself dissolved entirely in his absence, purple chakra dissipating into the smoke-filled air above an arena that had, somehow, against considerable odds, held on to its Hokage. The reanimated corpses of the first and second Hokages, released from Orochimaru's control, collapsed into inert stillness across the ruined arena floor, and Hiruzen found himself unable, even in the exhausted aftermath of the fight, to look directly at the faces of two men he had once served beside, honored, and mourned properly decades ago. Someone would need to see to a dignified end for them now, a second, quieter grief layered over everything else the day had already cost. I'll see it handled, Tsunade said quietly, following his gaze and understanding without needing to be told. Properly this time. They deserve that much, whatever indignity was done to them today. Hiruzen nodded, unable to manage words for a moment, and sank slowly to one knee, exhaustion finally overtaking him now that the immediate danger had passed. Tsunade was at his side instantly, chakra already glowing green between her hands as she began assessing the damage. You're going to be fine, she said, voice rough with relief she wasn't bothering to hide. Exhausted, and considerably too old to be doing this kind of thing, but fine. I've heard that particular scolding before, Hiruzen said, managing a tired, genuine smile despite everything. From you, if I recall correctly, more than once across the years. Naruto stood a short distance away, chains finally dissolving from his forearms, breathing hard, watching the two of them with an expression that mixed exhaustion and fierce, disbelieving relief in equal measure, understanding, slowly, that whatever else had happened today, they had just changed something that felt, in the quiet aftermath, considerably larger than a single battle. Chapter 9. Word of Orochimaru's retreat spread through the remaining invasion forces within the hour, and without their intended killing blow against the Hokage, the coordinated sound and sand assault lost its cohesion rapidly, scattered units pulling back toward the village's outer perimeter as Konoha's defenders, bolstered by the news that their leader had survived, pressed a renewed and considerably more organized counterattack. By the time the sun began sinking toward evening, the invasion had effectively broken, Retreating forces harried by pursuing shinobi teams as smoke continued rising from several damaged districts across the village. The physical cost of the day's fighting laid bare in collapsed buildings and exhausted medical staff working through a steady stream of wounded. Naruto found himself back at the hospital by early evening, chakra reserves nearly spent, sitting in a waiting room chair while Sakura fussed over a shallow cut along his forearm that he'd barely registered receiving sometime during the chaos. "You broke a Hokage-grade ceiling barrier," she said, disbelief still coloring her voice as she worked. "With your bare chains. That's not something genin are supposed to be able to do." "I had good instruction," Naruto said, wincing slightly as she finished the bandage with more force than strictly necessary. "And a lot of motivation." Sasuke sat nearby, curse mark contained once again beneath a fresh seal a visiting specialist had applied that afternoon, expression thoughtful and considerably more subdued than his usual composed reserve. "Twice today that mark almost took over completely. If you hadn't been there both times." "But I was," Naruto said, cutting off the spiral before it could fully form. "That's what matters. We'll figure out a better solution before it becomes a problem we can't manage." Across the village, in the reconvened council chamber, the aftermath carried its own quieter kind of tension. Hiruzen, recovered enough to preside despite Tsunade's visible disapproval of him working so soon after the day's exertion, formally reasserted full executive authority. The temporary joint command structure dissolved the moment he was capable of resuming his duties directly. "I want it noted for the record," Hiruzen said, voice carrying more weight than usual despite his obvious exhaustion, gaze settling deliberately on Danzo across the chamber, that the temporary authority granted during today's crisis has now formally ended, and that any further attempt to leverage village emergencies toward permanent restructuring of command will be treated with considerably less patience than I have extended until this point. Danzo's expression remained carefully neutral, betraying nothing of whatever calculation continued behind his single visible eye. "I acted only in the village's immediate interest, Hiruzen. I would hope that much is not in question." "Your intentions are very much in question, and have been for some time," Hiruzen said, flatly enough that several other council members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "We will discuss the specifics of today's authority transfer at a later session, in considerably more detail than the current circumstances allow. For now, I want this village's full attention on recovery, reconstruction, and identifying every remaining threat still active within our borders." The meeting dissolved shortly after, council members filing out toward their own recovery efforts across the damaged village, and Tsunade caught Hiruzen's arm as he made to follow, expression sharp with the particular concern she reserved for patients who insisted on ignoring her medical advice. "You should be resting, not presiding over council sessions," she said. "I will rest, once the reconstruction plans are properly underway and I'm satisfied the remaining threats are being tracked correctly," Hiruzen said, with the mild, immovable stubbornness of a man who had ignored similar advice for decades. "You know as well as I do that some things simply cannot wait for convenience, however sound the medical reasoning against them might be." "I know," Tsunade said, exasperation and grudging affection both audible in the words. "Doesn't mean I have to like watching you do it." Something tired but genuine crossed Hiruzen's weathered face as he studied her, gratitude underneath the exhaustion. "Thank you, Tsunade. Genuinely. I don't believe I would have survived today without you, and without that remarkable boy you've spent the past month training." "Don't thank me yet," Tsunade said, echoing her earlier words to him inside the barrier, though considerably more warmth colored them now than it had in the heat of battle. "We still have Orochimaru wounded and loose somewhere out there, Danzo circling like he's waiting for the next opportunity, and a boy who nearly lost himself to a curse mark twice today. Recovery's going to take considerably more than one good day's fighting." "No," Hiruzen agreed, looking out toward the smoke still rising over portions of the village skyline. "But it's a considerably better place to start from than we would have had, if you hadn't decided to stay." They stood together a moment longer in the quiet aftermath of the council chamber, two old shinobi who had both, in their own ways, spent years running from the weight of what this village had cost them, finding, in the ruins and slow recovery of the day, something that felt unexpectedly like common ground rather than merely shared history. "For what it's worth," Hiruzen added, "I meant what I said in there. This village survived today because of you, and because of the boy you've spent 2 months shaping into something considerably stronger than anyone expected. That's not a debt easily repaid, but I intend to try. You can start by actually resting, Tsunade said, though warmth softened the words considerably from the sharp reprimand they might once have carried. That would go a long way toward repaying it. Hiruzen laughed, tired but genuine, and allowed her to steer him gently toward the door. Chapter 10. The true fate of Tsunade's Kazekage emerged 2 days later, when a search team combing the outskirts of the village for remaining invasion stragglers discovered his body in a shallow grave outside the village walls, killed and impersonated by Orochimaru well before the invasion had even begun, his death carefully concealed to maintain the deception through the entire tournament. The revelation sent a fresh wave of shock through both villages, and Tsunade's delegation, led by an anxious and visibly shaken council of elders unprepared for the sudden loss of their leader, arrived at Konoha's gates within the week to formally address the fallout between the two villages. Gaara stood among the Tsunade delegation during the negotiations, quieter than Naruto remembered from their match, watching the proceedings with an expression that had lost much of its earlier flat detachment, replaced by something more uncertain, more genuinely present in a way that suggested whatever had shifted between them in the arena had continued settling in the days since. Naruto found him afterward, away from the formal negotiations, standing alone near the edge of the training grounds where their match had unofficially continued in a much different way. You look different, Naruto said, approaching carefully. I feel different. Gaara's gaze remained fixed on some middle distance, expression thoughtful in a way that seemed unfamiliar to his own face. My siblings have been talking to me. Actually talking, not just carefully managing me the way they usually do. I don't entirely know what to do with that yet. Give it time, Naruto said. That kind of thing doesn't fix itself overnight. Believe me, I know. Gaara studied him for a long moment, something searching in the look. Why did you talk to me the way you did, during our match? You could have simply won. The change you used against my defense, I could feel how close you were to breaking through completely, before you chose something else instead. Naruto considered the question seriously, thinking of a month spent learning patience from someone who had lost people she loved to exactly the kind of violence he could have chosen in that arena. Because winning by breaking you wouldn't have actually fixed anything. You'd have just been more alone afterward than you were before, and I know what that particular kind of alone feels like. Didn't seem worth it, just to prove I could beat you. My father would have called that weakness, Gaara said quietly. Choosing connection over victory. Your father's dead, and Orochimaru killed him to use his position as a weapon against people who trusted him, Naruto said, more bluntly than he'd intended, though something in Gaara's expression suggested the honesty was, somehow, exactly what he needed to hear rather than something to soften. Doesn't seem like his opinion on strength was worth much, in the end. Something that might, on a different face, have been the beginning of a genuine smile crossed Gaara's expression, brief and unpracticed but real. Perhaps not. They stood together in comfortable silence for a while after that, two boys who had spent most of their lives carrying something too heavy for anyone their age to manage alone, finding, in each other's company, a strange and unexpected kind of understanding neither had experienced with anyone else quite so directly. I don't know what I am now, outside of what I was raised to be, Gaara admitted eventually, quiet enough that Naruto almost missed it. The village will need a new Kazekage. Some among the council have already suggested I might eventually be considered, given my abilities, despite everything. How do you feel about that? Naruto asked. Uncertain. Gaara considered the question with the same careful, deliberate honesty he seemed to bring to every unfamiliar emotion now, turning it over rather than dismissing it outright. Part of me still expects it to be another test, another way of measuring my usefulness rather than genuine trust. But my siblings seemed, when the council first raised it, more hopeful than afraid. That's new. I don't entirely know what to do with hope directed at me instead of away from me. Give that time too, Naruto said. It gets easier to believe, the more people actually mean it. You'll figure it out, Naruto said, with the particular confident conviction that had, over the past month, grown considerably more grounded than the reckless bravado he'd once relied on entirely. Just don't let anyone convince you that being strong means being alone. That part's not true, no matter what anyone tells you. Gaara considered that for a long moment, turning the words over with the same careful attention he seemed to bring to every new idea now. You keep saying things like that. Simple things, almost. But they don't feel simple when you say them. That's probably because I spent a long time needing to hear them and not having anyone around to say them, Naruto admitted. Figured the least I could do was pass it along, now that I finally get it myself. Gaara nodded slowly, something settling in his posture that looked, for the first time since Naruto had met him, genuinely at peace rather than merely watchful, and when the Tsunade delegation departed several days later, formal peace terms reaffirmed and a fragile new trust cautiously established between the two villages, Gaara paused at the gate long enough to offer Naruto a small, uncertain nod that carried more genuine warmth than any formal diplomatic gesture the surrounding adults had managed throughout the entire negotiation. Chapter 11. 2 weeks after the invasion, Konoha had settled into the slow, steady rhythm of rebuilding, damaged districts scaffolded and under repair, the hospital's overflow finally thinning back toward manageable numbers, and the particular collective exhale of a village that had survived something it would spend considerable time processing in the months ahead. Tsunade found herself, somewhat to her own surprise, spending more time at the hospital than she had in over a decade, drawn back into the rhythms of medical work by the sheer volume of injuries the invasion had left behind, and discovering, with each patient she treated, that whatever fear had kept her running from medicine for so many years had, somewhere over the past month and a half, quietly loosened its grip. "You've been here every day this week," Shizen observed, watching her mentor finish a particularly delicate reconstruction on a Chunin's shattered leg with the same effortless precision she'd always possessed, precision that had simply gone unused for far too long. "That's not something I expected to see again." "Neither did I," Tsunade admitted, washing chakra residue from her hands at the hospital sink, expression thoughtful. "I think I forgot how much I actually loved this work, underneath everything else it had gotten tangled up with." "You could stay. Permanently, I mean. Not just until things settle." Tsunade considered that for a long moment, thinking of a boy whose chakra network had first pulled her back into a village she'd spent a decade avoiding, thinking of Hiruzen's tired gratitude in the aftermath of the invasion, thinking of the particular satisfaction of watching skills she'd feared were lost forever prove, over and over, that they had simply been waiting for a reason worth using them again. "I think I might," she said finally, something settling in her chest that felt considerably more solid than the restless drift she'd carried across the past decade. Hiruzen made the offer formal a few days later, summoning her to his office with an expression that carried more weight than his usual careful diplomacy suggested. "I want to propose something," he said, once she'd settled into the chair across from his desk. "Not immediately, and not without considerable further discussion, but I want you to know the thought has been forming since the moment you stepped through that barrier. This village needs steady leadership for its future, Tsunade, and after everything I've watched you do these past 2 months, I believe you're exactly the kind of leadership it needs." Tsunade's eyebrows rose sharply. "You're talking about succession." "I'm talking about a conversation we should have, when the time is right, and not before. You've earned the right to consider it on your own terms rather than being ambushed by the suggestion in the middle of a crisis." Hiruzen's tired smile carried genuine warmth despite the gravity of the offer. "For now, I would simply ask that you continue what you've already been doing. Training Naruto. Rebuilding your relationship with a village that, I think, has missed you considerably more than either of us realized." "I'll think about it," Tsunade said, which was, they both understood, considerably more of a concession than an outright refusal would have been. Hiruzen studied her a moment longer, something quietly satisfied in his weathered expression. "Take whatever time you need. I would only ask one thing in the meantime, selfishly." "What's that?" "Stay. Whatever you decide about the larger question, stay in this village a while longer. It's been better for having you in it these past 2 months than I think either of us fully expected." Tsunade did not answer that directly, only offered a small, unguarded smile that carried more genuine warmth than words might have managed, and left the office with something settled and steady in her chest that she had not felt in a very long time. Elsewhere, in a hidden base somewhere beyond Konoha's borders, Orochimaru recovered from his wound with the patient, clinical detachment he applied to most setbacks, Kabuto tending the injury with careful precision while listening to his master's quiet, calculating assessment of the day's failure. The boy's control has developed considerably faster than I anticipated, Orochimaru said, studying the ceiling of his recovery chamber with narrowed, thoughtful eyes. That barrier was not meant to be broken by anything short of a coordinated, sustained assault. He managed it essentially alone, with nothing but patience and a chain technique he's held for barely 2 months. Should we consider him a priority target, then, alongside the Uchiha? Perhaps eventually. For now, I think it more valuable to let him continue developing under Tsunade's instruction. Uncultivated potential is far less useful to me than fully realized potential, when the time finally comes to claim what I actually need. Orochimaru's smile carried none of its usual predatory hunger, replaced instead by something colder, more patient. We have time, Kabuto. Konoha believes today's failure represents a defeat. I prefer to think of it as valuable reconnaissance, purchased at an acceptable cost. Back in Konoha, unaware of the quiet, patient calculation continuing somewhere beyond the village's borders, Naruto spent his evening exactly as he'd spent most evenings since the invasion, training alongside Tsunade in the fading evening light, chains and clones moving with a steadily growing precision that neither of them showed any sign of considering finished. Chapter 12. The formal council session addressing Danzo's conduct during the invasion convened 3 weeks after the attack, once the immediate demands of reconstruction had eased enough to permit the kind of careful, deliberate scrutiny the matter required. Naruto was not present for the session itself, genin rank affording him no standing in such proceedings. But Kakashi relayed the outcome that evening with the particular flat neutrality he used when discussing news he found genuinely frustrating. They censured him, Kakashi said, settling onto the low wall beside the training ground where Naruto and Tsunade had just finished another evening session. Formally reprimanded for exceeding his authority during the crisis, restrictions placed on Root's independent operational capacity going forward, subject to more direct Hokage oversight. But he's still around, Naruto said, reading the unspoken part of the report correctly. Still got his position. Still around, Kakashi confirmed. The council wasn't willing to go further than censure without more concrete evidence connecting him to actions beyond the authority grab itself. Danzo's very good at ensuring nothing traces back to him cleanly. Tsunade's expression had gone hard and unsurprised, the particular grim acceptance of someone who had expected exactly this outcome from the moment the invasion's chaos first handed Danzo his opportunity. It's not the ending I wanted. But it's a real check, not nothing. He'll have to work considerably harder from here to move against Naruto directly, and every attempt from now on gets scrutinized more closely than it would have a month ago. For now, Naruto said, quiet frustration coloring the words. Feels like it's never actually over with people like him. It usually isn't, Tsunade said, not bothering to soften the truth of it. But that doesn't mean the fight isn't worth continuing. Some battles you win outright. Others you just keep winning a little at a time, for as long as it takes. They stood together in comfortable silence for a while, watching the last light fade over the village skyline, still marked in places by the ongoing work of reconstruction but steadier now, more settled than it had been in the immediate aftermath of the invasion. Later that evening, in the quiet privacy of the Hokage's tower, Hiruzen reviewed a report that had arrived earlier that day through one of Konoha's more distant intelligence contacts, expression growing increasingly troubled as he read through details that had nothing to do with Orochimaru, nothing to do with Danzo, nothing to do with any threat currently occupying the village's immediate attention. The report described, in careful, uncertain terms, a pattern of disappearances across several minor shinobi nations, Jinchuriki from smaller villages vanishing without explanation over the past several years, and a recurring description, gathered from scattered, unreliable witnesses, of cloaked figures marked with red clouds moving through the affected regions shortly before each disappearance occurred. Hiruzen set the report down slowly, old instincts sharpening despite the exhaustion of the past several weeks, and found himself thinking, with growing unease, of a blonde-haired boy currently training somewhere across the village, carrying a burden that had already drawn the attention of one dangerous organization and might, if this report's careful, worried speculation proved accurate, eventually draw the attention of something considerably larger and more coordinated than a single rogue. Sannin's personal ambitions. He did not mention it to Naruto that evening, nor to Tsunade, deciding, for now, that the boy deserved at least a little more time to simply be 12 years old, training under a patient teacher, surrounded by teammates who had become something close to genuine family, before the full weight of what might be coming eventually found its way to his door. But he filed the report carefully away in a drawer reserved for concerns too significant to ignore and too uncertain to act on yet, and sat alone in his office a while longer as evening settled fully over the village, watching the lights come on gradually across a skyline that had survived one crisis only to sit, unknowingly, at the edge of another far larger one still gathering somewhere beyond the horizon, patient and unhurried, waiting for its moment to arrive. Outside his window, the village continued its slow, steady work of healing, scaffolding rising over damaged rooftops, lanterns lit along streets that had, only weeks earlier, echoed with the sounds of invasion, and somewhere among all of it, a boy who had already survived considerably more than most shinobi twice his age trained on into the darkening evening, chains and clones moving with growing precision. Entirely unaware of the shadow just beginning, patiently, to fall across his future, Hiruzen watched the lanterns a while longer, thinking of red clouds and vanishing Jinchuriki, thinking of a Sannin still recovering somewhere beyond the village's reach, thinking of Danzo's quiet, patient ambition still circling despite today's setback, and found himself, not for the first time since Naruto's chakra had first revealed its strange, unfinished bloodline weeks ago, deeply grateful that the boy had found, in Tsunade, someone willing to stand beside him through whatever still lay ahead. Thanks for listening.